The plan had been simple. My friends and I were going to spend the weekend in a cabin up in the mountains. It was one of those cozy, secluded places far enough from the city that you'd feel like you were truly out of touch with the rest of the world. The air up there was fresh, the silence thick, and the view was breathtaking. We'd rented it for a weekend getaway, thinking it would be the perfect spot to escape the noise and stress of life. But as the night wore on, I began to realize that the calm I had hoped for was quickly turning into something much darker. The cabin was old, rustic, and smelled like pine and wood smoke. It had everything we needed: comfortable couches, a fireplace, a kitchen stocked with the basics, and a porch that overlooked a valley with towering trees and steep hills. There were no neighbors, no lights in the distance, just the woods stretching out in every direction. We thought we'd be safe here. I thought we'd be safe here. I was 25, a few years out of college, still trying to figure out where my life was headed. My two friends, Ben and Sarah, were with me. Ben, always the life of the party, had insisted on the trip. Sarah, more laid back and down to earth, had been happy to go along. We didn't know it at the time, but this trip would be one we wouldn't forget, though for all the wrong reasons. We'd arrived on Friday afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The air had that crisp autumn feel to it, like it was still holding on to the last bits of warmth before the cold weather really set in. After unloading the car, we spent the next few hours unpacking, starting a fire, and getting settled in. By the time nightfall came, we were all sitting around the fireplace, laughing and joking like we always did when we were together. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first. I'd catch a glimpse of something moving outside, a shadow in the corner of my eye, but when I'd look, there would be nothing there. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, the woods were full of wildlife. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon, maybe a squirrel. I convinced myself that it was nothing. By the time we finished dinner, the wind had picked up. I could hear it howling outside, rustling the trees and making the branches groan under the strain. It was the kind of wind that made you feel small, like the woods could easily swallow you up if you weren't paying attention. We decided to go outside for a bit, to stretch our legs and enjoy the night air before it got too cold. We grabbed our jackets and stepped out onto the porch. The night sky was clear, the stars so bright they looked like they were right on top of us. There was no light pollution out here, just the glow of the fire inside and the soft, distant twinkling of the stars above. It should have been peaceful, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my discomfort. "Yeah, just a little tired," I replied, trying to brush it off. "I think I'm just not used to being out here alone, you know?" I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have realized how strange it was that we were completely alone, so far from civilization, in the middle of the woods. No cell service, no one else for miles. We stayed outside for a while, enjoying the firelight and talking, but as the wind picked up, the chill grew unbearable and we went back inside. The warmth of the cabin felt comforting in comparison to the cold that was starting to settle in. That night, as we settled into our separate rooms, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. Ben and Sarah went to bed, but I stayed up a little longer, trying to shake the growing sense of unease that had taken hold of me. I made sure the windows were all locked, checked the doors, and even peeked out the front to make sure no one was there. Of course, no one was. The woods were silent, almost too silent. I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, trying to get some sleep, but I couldn't. My mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept thinking about that feeling of being watched, the feeling that there was something out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it. A loud thud outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against the side of the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind this time. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. I tried to tell myself it was just a tree branch falling, or maybe an animal scurrying by. But then I heard it again, a soft scratching sound, like someone was dragging their fingers across the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound continued for what felt like hours, and with each passing minute, my anxiety grew. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake Ben and Sarah? What if there was someone outside? What if it was a bear or something worse? The cabin was so isolated. If something went wrong, we'd have no way of getting help. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly slipped out of bed and made my way to the window, pulling the curtains just enough to see outside. The porch light was casting a dim glow across the front of the cabin, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadow, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then, just as I was about to step back from the window, I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the trees, just beyond the edge of the porch light's reach. I gasped and stepped back, my heart racing. Was it a person, or was I imagining it? I quickly grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I was completely alone out here, trapped in the woods with something, or someone, watching me. I had to wake Ben. I had to tell someone, but I was paralyzed, unable to move. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stay hidden, to stay silent. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, watching the figure. Eventually, it moved. Slowly, almost unnaturally, it began to walk around the side of the cabin. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door and shook Ben awake. "Ben!" I hissed. "Someone's out there. I saw them. I swear to God, I saw them." Ben groggily rubbed his eyes and sat up, clearly annoyed at being woken up so abruptly. "What are you talking about? It's probably just an animal. You're being paranoid." But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew something wasn't right. We sat there in silence, listening for any sign of movement outside. The wind had died down, and all we could hear was the occasional creak of the cabin's old wooden frame. Eventually, after what felt like forever, we decided to check the outside ourselves. We grabbed a flashlight, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch. The light illuminated the area around us, but there was nothing, just the same empty woods stretching out into the night. We checked the perimeter of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no fresh scratches on the walls, nothing. It was just the three of us, alone in the woods, or so I thought. We went back inside, and for the rest of the night, no one spoke. Everyone stayed in their rooms, locked up tight, afraid to go back to sleep, afraid of what we'd seen or thought we saw. The rest of the weekend was a blur. The unease didn't go away. Each time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the porch light. And though nothing else happened, I knew we weren't alone. Not truly. By the time we packed up to leave, the sense of dread was still thick in the air. I didn't say it out loud, but I was relieved to be leaving. The cabin, the woods, everything about it felt wrong now. The place that had seemed so peaceful and calming had turned into something sinister. It wasn't until we got home that I saw the real evidence of what had happened that weekend. There were fresh scratch marks along the cabin's back door, marks that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a raccoon or a tree branch. Someone had been there, and I don't know if we'll ever know who it was, or if they're still out there. I was 37 years old when I decided to rent a remote cabin in Montana. I had been working as a freelance surveyor, mostly for rural property lines, and business had slowed down a lot. My sister told me I needed a break. I hadn't taken a vacation in 5 years, so I figured she was right. I found the cabin online. It was owned by a retired forestry worker who lived about 30 miles away. The place was tucked into the northwestern corner of the state, far enough from the nearest town that you couldn't hear any road traffic. The guy who rented it to me said it was originally built in the 60s and had a generator and a basic well pump. No internet, no cable, no cell service unless I climbed up a hill about a mile behind the property. That was fine with me. I wasn't trying to stream movies. I just wanted quiet. The drive out there was longer than I thought it would be. I left Missoula around 9 in the morning, stopped twice for food and gas, and finally reached the cabin around 3. The gravel road that led to it was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for my truck. I had to keep one tire practically in the grass just to stay away from the ditch that ran along one side. There was a small wooden sign nailed to a tree with the number 13 burned into it. That was the only indication I had arrived. The cabin was a simple A-frame with a little porch in the front and a woodpile stacked under the overhang. It looked older than the pictures, but still solid. The windows were clean. The steps creaked when I walked up them. There was no lock on the front door, just a metal latch you could slide from the inside. I remember thinking that was weird, but I didn't feel worried at the time. I figured it was just one of those places so far out nobody bothered locking anything. Inside was just as basic. A table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thick wool blanket, a cast iron stove, and some metal shelves with canned food, extra matches, and a few candles. There was a flashlight hanging by the door and a stack of firewood in the corner. No bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 yards into the trees. The place smelled like pine and dust, but it wasn't musty. I could tell someone had cleaned it recently. The first day was uneventful. I brought in my gear, which was just a duffel bag, a backpack, and some groceries. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed just because I didn't trust the mattress. I spent some time walking around the area, getting a feel for the land. There was a creek not far from the cabin and a small hill behind it, maybe 200 feet higher than the cabin's elevation. The forest was thick with spruce and lodgepole pine, and I saw tracks from deer and what looked like maybe a black bear. I was used to that sort of thing. Nothing about it felt unsafe. That night was quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just the steady ticking of the stove cooling off after I'd burned some kindling to take the edge off the cold. I fell asleep early, woke up once around 2 a.m. to pee and stepped outside into the cold. The stars were incredible. I could see the Milky Way like a streak of white paint across the sky. The second day is when I noticed something strange. I was halfway through a cup of coffee around 10 in the morning, standing on the porch and watching the woods. That's when I saw someone, or at least I thought I did. At the edge of the trees, maybe 80 yards out, I caught a flash of movement. It was just for a second, like someone stepping behind a tree. I stared for a long time, waiting to see it again. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but the movement felt wrong. It was too upright, too fast. I walked out to where I thought I saw it and checked around, but I didn't find anything. No tracks, no broken branches. I went back inside and forgot about it after a while. That night, I heard something just after I went to bed. It sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel and leaves. I froze. I listened hard, trying to be sure. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal trotting. These were heavy steps, like a person walking. They stopped after a minute, and everything was silent again. I sat there in the dark, my ears straining. Then I heard them again, this time near the back of the cabin. The crunch of leaves, slow and quiet. I didn't have a gun with me, only a hatchet I used for firewood. I slid out of bed and grabbed it, standing in the dark near the door. My heart was pounding, but the steps never came closer, and after a few minutes, I didn't hear anything at all. I stayed awake for hours after that, watching the windows, waiting for some shadow to move or a figure to appear. Nothing did. The next morning, I found footprints around the back of the cabin. They were clearly from boots. Heavy tread. They circled the cabin once, stopping near the back corner and then turning toward the woods. I followed them for maybe 30 yards before they disappeared into the forest. It had rained a little that night, just a light mist, so the prints were fresh. They hadn't washed away yet. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The nearest property was probably miles away. Who would be out here in the middle of the night, walking around my cabin? I spent most of that day on edge. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I didn't go far. I kept the hatchet with me the whole time. I even started keeping the door latched during the day, which I hadn't done before. I didn't sleep much that night either. I left the candle burning low on the table, just so I wouldn't be in total darkness. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something again. This time it was softer. Not footsteps, something brushing against the side of the cabin. Then it stopped. In the morning, I found scratches on the wooden wall near the back window. 3 parallel lines, like someone had dragged something sharp across the wood. It didn't look like claws. It looked like metal, maybe a knife or the edge of a hatchet. That's when I decided I needed to leave. But when I turned the ignition in my truck, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I checked the battery. The terminals were loose. Not just loose, completely removed. Both wires were unplugged and hanging. I hadn't touched them. I reattached them and started the truck. It worked fine, but now I was sure someone had been messing with me. This wasn't a coincidence. I loaded my bag into the truck, but I hesitated. It was strange. I'd come all the way out here to get away from people, and now I felt like if I drove off, I was letting whoever this was win. Like I was running. I'm not proud of that thinking, but that's how it felt at the time. I told myself I'd stay one more night. I'd keep watch. Maybe catch a glimpse of whoever was doing this. Then I'd leave in the morning. That was a mistake. I didn't go to bed that night. I sat in a chair facing the door, the hatchet on my lap, the flashlight on the table next to me. I kept the candle lit. Every few minutes I stood and looked out the windows. Around midnight, I saw something, a figure standing just inside the tree line. I couldn't make out the face, but it was tall, wearing a hood or a hat, just standing there watching. I turned off the candle and moved to the window slowly. When I looked again, it was gone. I didn't hear it move, didn't hear anything. I waited another hour, nothing. Then, just after 2 a.m., I heard the porch steps creak. My blood went cold. I didn't move. I held the hatchet tighter. Then I saw the shadow through the window, a silhouette standing right at the door. I could see the outline of a shoulder and part of a head. It didn't knock, didn't try the latch. It just stood there. I held my breath and didn't move. After maybe a minute, it stepped off the porch. I ran to the window and looked out. The figure was walking back toward the woods. No flashlight, no sound. I left at first light. I didn't pack. I just grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and drove out of there without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I tried to report it to the local sheriff, but there wasn't much they could do. They sent a deputy to check the place, but they didn't find anything. No one was caught, nothing stolen. They said it was probably just a squatter or someone passing through. But I don't believe that. Whoever it was knew I was there. They came at night. They circled the cabin. They messed with the truck. They scratched the walls. They wanted me to know they were there. I never went back. I stopped renting cabins altogether. Even now, years later, I can't stay somewhere remote without checking the locks 5 times. I always bring a weapon. I never sleep deeply. I don't care if people think I'm paranoid, because I know what I saw, and I know someone was out there, watching me, waiting, and they weren't just passing through. It had been a long time since I'd been to the cabin. A few years, actually. After everything that happened, I didn't really want to go back. But when my buddy Scott suggested we head up there for a weekend getaway, I hesitated but ultimately agreed. The cabin was isolated, tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It had been passed down from his family, an old, creaky place with wood that groaned when the wind picked up. It was one of those places where silence wasn't just a lack of noise. It felt thick, oppressive almost. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows through the towering trees. I didn't expect anyone else to be up there. It was always a quiet place. Scott and I had been friends for years, but we hadn't really spent time together since high school. Life had gotten in the way, work, family, everything. So when he mentioned going to the cabin, I thought it would be a good way to reconnect. The first thing that hit me when I stepped out of the truck was the smell of pine and damp earth. The air was cool but not cold, a sign that winter was just starting to loosen its grip. The cabin stood before us, dark and still, nestled against the hillside like it had been waiting for us to return. It was a small building, 2 rooms, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen with an old wooden table. The walls were lined with dark pine, and the windows were large, giving you a view of the surrounding forest. Scott and I unloaded the gear and made our way inside. There were no lights, no electricity out here, just a few candles and the dim glow from the fire. We set everything up, and I immediately felt the weight of isolation. It was strange. I had spent countless weekends in cabins growing up, but this one was different. There was something off about it. We spent the evening by the fire, cracking open a couple of beers and reminiscing about old times. The night fell quickly, and by 10 p.m., the fire had died down to embers. That's when the noises started. At first, it was subtle. A creak from the floorboards, a sound like something moving in the walls. I figured it was just the house settling. It was an old building, after all. But as the night wore on, the noises became more distinct. There was a scraping sound, followed by a faint tapping, like someone was walking around on the roof, or maybe scratching at the windows. I brushed it off. Probably just an animal, I said to Scott, though even I didn't believe it. We both knew animals didn't make noises like that. Still, we didn't say much about it. Instead, we threw another log on the fire, and the creaking and tapping seemed to fade, at least for a while. It wasn't until after midnight that things started getting really strange. I had just finished brushing my teeth and was heading back into the main room when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, tall and thin, flickering just beyond the window. It was quick, disappearing the moment I turned to look. I stopped, heart pounding. Scott was asleep on the couch, the blanket pulled up over his head. I didn't want to wake him. I didn't want to be the paranoid one. But there it was again. The shadow. This time, I saw it more clearly, lingering for a moment before ducking out of view. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and walked cautiously to the window. The woods outside were completely still, the trees silent under the weight of the night. No movement, no rustling leaves. I waited, shining the beam of light across the yard, but there was nothing, just darkness stretching out beyond the cabin. I stood there for a while, feeling stupid. Maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. It had been a long day and I was tired. When I returned to the couch, I told myself I was being ridiculous, trying to rationalize away whatever had just happened. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I tried to close my eyes, but my mind kept replaying the image of that shadow, lingering outside. And then I heard it again, the tapping. This time it was louder, more insistent. Someone or something was knocking on the cabin door. My blood ran cold. I knew Scott hadn't heard it. He was still snoring softly, oblivious to whatever was going on. But I wasn't going to sit there and pretend everything was fine. I got up and moved toward the door, carefully checking the lock. It was secure, but that didn't stop the feeling that something was wrong. That sensation you get when you know you're being watched, but you can't see who's doing the watching. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I hesitated, staring at the door. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal or some other natural phenomenon. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This was something different. I crept over to the window, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. No movement, no shapes. Yet the knocking continued, now accompanied by a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my coat and opened the door. The cold hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. There was nothing in front of the cabin. No signs of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. Just the eerie silence of the forest surrounding me. I closed the door quickly, heart racing. The knocking had stopped, but the dragging sound continued. It seemed to come from behind the cabin, near the woodshed. The shed was old, leaning to one side, its door hanging crookedly on its hinges. I debated for a long moment, listening to the scraping sounds coming from behind it. In the end, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to investigate. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the toolbox near the fireplace and made my way outside. My breath hung in the air, thick and cold. I rounded the corner of the cabin, the flashlight beam sweeping over the ground until it landed on the shed. And that's when I saw it. There was something out there, lying in the dirt, a bundle of rags. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't rags at all. It was a body. I froze, my stomach lurching. It was someone, a man, though his face was unrecognizable. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in dirt. His hands were clawing at the ground, as if he had tried to drag himself away from something. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, but I forced myself to take another step closer. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a loud crack from behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the dark, the endless expanse of the forest. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed away from the body. That's when the real terror set in, the realization that we weren't alone. We weren't alone, and whatever was out there was still watching. It was early October 2019, and I had been going through a stretch of burnout that I just couldn't shake. I was 35 at the time, living alone in Chicago, working as a freelance web developer. Most of my work was remote, and I had the kind of freedom that sounded good on paper: work from anywhere, pick your own hours, but in practice it felt like I was always either working or feeling guilty for not working. I hadn't really disconnected from my laptop in months. A friend of mine had mentioned a cabin he stayed at in northern Wisconsin. Quiet, off the grid, no internet, no phone signal. I asked him for the details. He sent me a rough location and said the place was managed by some family friend, and he'd texted them to let them know I might reach out. It wasn't one of those Airbnb-type places. It was just a rustic wooden cabin by a lake, maybe 30 minutes outside of a small town called Crandon. The guy who owned it was apparently fine with people staying there as long as they respected the property and left it how they found it. Sounded perfect. I told myself I'd go for a week. Bring some food, my camera, maybe a few books. No laptop, no work, just air, trees, and quiet. I left on a Monday morning. I remember it being gray and overcast, that kind of chill that lets you know fall is serious now. I drove my 2009 Subaru Outback north, stopping only for gas and groceries in a town called Rhinelander, which was about an hour south of Crandon. I bought simple stuff: cans of chili, granola bars, bottled water, apples, and a few other snacks. I brought a sleeping bag, a camp stove, and a few flashlights just in case. I wanted to be ready for anything. I even packed a small hatchet and a folding knife, mostly for chopping wood or random chores. The road to the cabin wasn't easy to find. My GPS cut out about 20 minutes outside Crandon. From there, I was relying on the notes my friend sent me. There was an old logging road off County Road W that curved into a patch of thick forest. No street signs, no markers, just a narrow trail that looked like no one had used it in years. If you weren't looking for it, you'd drive right past. I followed the dirt trail slowly, branches brushing the sides of my car, tires crunching over leaves and gravel. After about 2 miles, the trees opened up to reveal a clearing. The cabin sat near the edge of a calm lake, surrounded by pines and maples just starting to turn. It was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a sloped tin roof and a little porch with 2 wooden chairs. No neighbors, no traffic noise, just wind and water and trees. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt something I hadn't in months. Silence. Not just quiet, but true silence. No humming refrigerators, no email pings, no sirens in the distance. Just the sound of breeze in the trees and the soft ripple of water. The cabin was unlocked, just like my friend said it would be. It was basic: wooden floor, a table, 2 chairs, a small counter, a shelf of old books, and a narrow cot with a thin mattress. There was a small cast iron stove in the corner, with a few logs stacked nearby. No electricity, no plumbing, just 4 walls, a roof, and a bucket for drawing water from the lake. I unpacked what I needed, stored my food in a cooler, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. Then I walked out to the lake, sat down on a log, and just watched the light change on the water. For the first time in ages, I felt like I wasn't wasting time. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked around the lake, took photos of deer tracks and mushrooms, listened to birds, and spent hours just sitting with a book or watching the water. I cooked simple meals on my camp stove and went to bed when the sun went down. I didn't hear or see a single person. It was everything I wanted. On the 3rd morning, something changed. I woke up around 6 a.m. It was still dark outside and cold. I got up to go outside and relieve myself. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something odd. The dirt on the steps looked different. There were fresh marks, like something or someone had been there. Not footprints exactly, just the disturbed shape of something heavy dragging lightly across the surface. At first, I figured it might have been a raccoon or deer, but the pattern wasn't right. It was too wide for a paw, and it looked like it came up the steps, then turned around and left. I brushed it off. Could have been anything. A branch blowing in the wind. A raccoon carrying something. I didn't want to let my imagination run wild. That afternoon, I hiked a few miles north, following a faint trail through the woods. I was maybe an hour from the cabin when I spotted something strange up ahead. Tire tracks. Very faint, but definitely from a vehicle. It didn't make sense. This far into the woods, there shouldn't be any cars. I followed the tracks for a bit until they veered off and disappeared into the brush. There was no road, no path, just those few marks in the dirt and some snapped twigs. I turned back and hurried to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. I kept the hatchet beside my cot, just in case. I reminded myself I was probably just on edge from being alone so long. But then, the fourth day happened. I went out early that morning to grab water from the lake. As I walked back, I noticed something on the side of the cabin. A single scratch mark, deep and vertical, carved into the wood. Not huge, but fresh. I ran my fingers over it. It was too deep to be from a branch in the wind. It looked deliberate, like someone had dragged a knife or tool down the wall. I circled the cabin. That was the only mark. I checked the woods. Nothing. No sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That afternoon, I decided to leave. I packed everything quickly. The food, the gear, my sleeping bag. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I just didn't want to spend another night out there. I threw everything into the back of the car, jumped in, and drove down the trail as fast as I could without damaging the tires. The dirt road felt longer this time. The branches scraped harder, like the woods didn't want me to leave. When I reached the end of the trail, I stopped cold. A metal chain had been stretched across the entrance, padlocked to two trees. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. It definitely hadn't been there. Someone had blocked the way out. I got out and examined the lock. It wasn't rusted. It was new, still shiny. I pulled on it, tried to break it with the hatchet, but it wouldn't budge. That moment is when the panic really set in. No cell signal, no internet, no neighbors, no road out. I thought about walking back to town, but it would take hours, possibly a full day, and I didn't know if whoever chained the road was still nearby. I didn't know what I'd be walking into, so I did the only thing I could do. I backed the car up the trail and returned to the cabin. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I sat up, holding the hatchet, flashlight by my side, watching the window. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Not even the usual rustle of small animals, just stillness. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, deliberate scrape along the back wall of the cabin. Then a pause. Then another. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened. The scraping continued, slow and even, like someone dragging something sharp across the wood. Then silence. I waited until dawn before moving. As soon as the light came up, I stepped outside. There were new marks on the back of the cabin. Deeper this time. More than one. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, shoved it full of food and supplies, and left the rest. I set out on foot, moving fast, following the trail until I reached the blocked road. That's when I saw it. Another chain, newly stretched across the other side of the logging road, a few hundred yards beyond the first one. It was like someone wanted to trap me between two locks. Whoever they were, they'd planned this. I didn't stop. I climbed under the first chain, cut through brush, and followed what looked like a deer trail through the woods. I had no map, no compass, just the sun and a vague sense of direction. By early afternoon, I found a gravel road. It wasn't on any map I'd seen, but it was something. I followed it for what felt like hours until I spotted a truck parked by a clearing. No one in it. I kept walking. Eventually, a pickup came down the road toward me. I waved it down. The man inside looked surprised to see me. I made up a story. Said my car had broken down near a trail and I'd gotten lost. He drove me to a gas station near Crandon. I didn't go back for the car. I called a tow company later, gave them vague directions, and had them recover it. I never explained why. I never told the police either. What would I say? That someone scratched my cabin and locked a road? But I know what I saw. I know someone was there, watching, waiting, and I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. I haven't gone camping since. I haven't left the city for anything more remote than a state park. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night, certain I heard a scrape on the wall. I always check. I always keep the lights on. I didn't expect this trip to turn into anything more than a weekend getaway. Just a simple retreat into the woods, away from the constant noise of city life. But now, looking back on everything that happened, I realize how wrong I was. It all started on a Friday morning in early October. The air was crisp, just cold enough to see your breath in the air. The trees had started to change color, shades of red, orange, and yellow against the pale blue sky. I was 32, working a desk job that had me chained to a screen for most of the week. I needed the break. My wife, Lisa, and I had talked about doing this for a while. We'd rented a small, old cabin about 3 hours outside of town, deep into the woods in a part of the country I had never been to before. The cabin was in a place called Pine Ridge, a remote spot near a quiet town. Not much there, just a few old houses, a handful of stores, and a general sense of isolation. We arrived in the early afternoon. The road was narrow, winding through tall trees on both sides. It wasn't paved, and I had to drive slowly to avoid hitting rocks and deep ruts. Lisa sat next to me, her hands in her lap, watching the trees flash by. When we finally got to the cabin, I felt a sense of peace, like I had finally arrived at a place where I could leave all my stress behind. It was an old structure, built from weathered wood, surrounded by thick forest. The roof had patches of moss growing on it, and there were vines crawling up the sides of the house. The windows were small, but the cabin had a sort of charm. The kind of rustic charm you see in movies about people escaping their busy lives to reconnect with nature. We unpacked our things quickly, excited to get settled in. I remember Lisa humming softly as she unpacked the bags. While I went to check out the inside, the floors creaked under my feet, and the air smelled like old pine and wood smoke. The living room had a stone fireplace with a few chairs placed around it. A small kitchen was off to the side, and a narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms. One of the rooms was a bit darker than the other, but both had old quilts on the beds and heavy wooden furniture. We spent the first few hours unpacking, setting up for a relaxing weekend. The weather was starting to turn, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Lisa started a fire in the fireplace, and we made a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just canned soup and bread. It was perfect. We ate in silence, listening to the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. After dinner, we decided to go for a walk around the area. We had seen a trailhead not far from the cabin when we arrived, so we bundled up in jackets and grabbed our flashlights. The sky was dark by then, with clouds moving in quickly. The air had a strange stillness to it, as if the forest was holding its breath. We followed the trail as it wound deeper into the woods. The path was uneven, and I had to watch my step to avoid tripping over roots or rocks. It was quiet out there, too quiet. I don't know how to describe it, but the usual sounds of the forest seemed to have disappeared. No rustling of animals, no chirping of crickets. It was just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the leaves and the occasional gust of wind. Lisa didn't seem to notice, but I kept glancing around, feeling an odd unease settling over me. After about an hour, we turned back toward the cabin. We hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, just the occasional deer track or scattered animal bones on the trail. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone or something lurking just outside of the light. Back at the cabin, I was ready to call it a night. Lisa seemed tired too, so we went to bed. The cabin had no electricity, so the only light came from candles and the fire in the living room. We both climbed under the thick blankets, the warmth of the fire slowly fading as the house grew colder. I remember lying there, trying to fall asleep, but every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The wind howled outside, and the occasional creak of the house made me feel like something was moving just out of sight. Then came the noise. It wasn't anything big. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it was unmistakable. Something scratching against the wooden floorboards just outside our room. I lay still, listening intently, my heart starting to beat faster. The scratching continued for several seconds before stopping. I waited, listening for more. Nothing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal outside, or maybe the wind doing strange things to the old house. But then, the scratching started again, this time louder and more deliberate. It was right outside our door. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I sat up in bed. Lisa was still asleep, oblivious to the noise. I wanted to wake her, but I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. The scratching didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floor, right at the base of the door. The noise was getting worse, like something was trying to claw its way in. I got out of bed quietly, trying not to wake Lisa. My legs were shaky as I grabbed the flashlight off the nightstand. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, and I slowly approached the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, heart hammering in my chest. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe an animal trapped beneath the floorboards. Maybe nothing at all. But when I opened the door, there was nothing there. Just empty darkness. I stepped out into the hallway, shining the light across the floor. There were no marks or scratches. Nothing that could explain the noise. I felt ridiculous, like I had been imagining it all. But something still felt off. I checked the rest of the cabin, the flashlight shaking in my hands. Everything was as it should be. Silent, still, undisturbed. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next day, we went into town to pick up a few supplies. The town was small, one street lined with old brick buildings. There wasn't much to see, but we stopped at the general store to grab some snacks and talk to the owner. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a rough voice and graying hair. I didn't mention the noises from the night before. Figured it was just some weird coincidence. But when I asked him about the cabin, he looked at me oddly. "Cabin's been there a long time," he said, his tone flat. "Been there since the 1800s, but it's been abandoned a few times. Folks say it's always been quiet, but there's been some strange things out that way. People don't stay long." I didn't know what to make of that, so I just smiled and nodded. We finished up and headed back to the cabin. The rest of the day was uneventful, spent hiking through the woods and just relaxing. By evening, I was feeling better. No more strange noises, no eerie feeling in the air. The cabin seemed normal again, as it had been when we first arrived. That night, we slept soundly. The next morning, we decided to pack up and head home a little early. Something about the place had started to get to me. It wasn't the noises, it wasn't the isolation. It was just the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't explain it, but I wanted to leave. As we loaded the car, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin one last time. The wind had picked up again, and the trees seemed to sway and groan in the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, something that wasn't quite finished yet. But I didn't want to stay any longer. I started the car and drove away, heading back toward the main road. And that was it. We left Pine Ridge behind, and I never looked back. In the end, nothing terrible happened. No one was hurt, and the strange noises could have been explained away. Maybe it was just an old house settling. Maybe it was the wind or animals moving around outside. But I don't think I'll ever forget that feeling of unease. The quiet that felt too deep, the sense of being watched. It's been years now, and I still can't fully shake it off. I guess some things are just meant to stay unanswered. I hadn't planned on spending the weekend at the cabin alone. It was supposed to be a family trip, but a series of things fell apart. My wife, Kate, had to stay home for work, and the kids were out of town visiting my parents. I had always told myself that I loved the peace and quiet of being alone, But that Friday evening, as I pulled up to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel something was off. The sun had just set, casting long, dark shadows over the dirt road that led to the cabin. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling my lungs as I parked the car. I felt that familiar weight in the pit of my stomach, the one I ignored every time I went on one of these solo trips. But tonight, it was different. The silence of the woods was deafening. The cabin itself was small, a rustic, single-story structure tucked away in a remote part of the woods. I had bought it a few years ago, looking for a place to escape from the noise of the city. It was perfect for the weekends when I needed some time to reset. I grabbed my bag and the cooler from the trunk, walking toward the front door. There was a slight squeak when I opened it, the wooden frame protesting as I stepped inside. The place was exactly as I remembered it. Simple, with a stone fireplace, a couple of old couches, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. Nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. The wooden floors creaked under my boots as I set my things down. The first few hours weren't so bad. I made myself some dinner, grilled a couple of steaks outside on the small barbecue, and sat on the porch with a cold beer, watching the stars appear as the night settled in. The air was chilly, but it was refreshing after a long drive. As I finished my beer, I headed back inside, feeling a bit lighter. The moment I locked the door behind me, I noticed a faint sound coming from the woods. It was a rustling, like something or someone was moving through the brush. My first instinct was to brush it off as an animal, but the noise was persistent, almost deliberate. I stood still, listening, but it didn't come again. Maybe a raccoon or a deer, I thought. I hadn't been here alone for long stretches, but I had camped enough to know that animals were everywhere in the woods, making strange noises when you least expected them. I shrugged it off and decided to watch a movie to wind down. But even as the flickering light of the TV cast shadows on the walls, I felt uneasy. There was something in the back of my mind, a nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. The noise outside had unsettled me more than I was willing to admit, and as I sat there, watching a random action film, I felt like I was being watched. I turned off the TV and checked the front door again, locking it for a second time just to be sure. I stood there for a moment, listening. The rustling sound had stopped. I couldn't hear anything. I headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, unable to quiet the constant, gnawing feeling of something being wrong. I finally dozed off, but my sleep was light, interrupted by dreams that I couldn't remember but made me stir every few minutes. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. I had heard something. It was loud enough to pull me from my sleep, but I couldn't place it. My heart raced as I listened, straining to hear through the thick walls of the cabin. There it was again, the same rustling sound from earlier. It was louder now, closer. I held my breath, listening carefully. The sound was unmistakable. It was no animal. It was footsteps, the faint crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. Someone was out there, walking around the cabin. I couldn't move for a moment, frozen in place. My mind raced as I tried to piece things together. There was no one nearby for miles. No neighbors, no other cabins. I was alone, or so I thought. I grabbed the small flashlight on the nightstand and crept to the window. I slowly pulled the curtain aside, careful not to make a sound. The beam of light from the flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the front yard. Nothing. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw something move. A shadow. It was brief, but it was there, just outside the range of the flashlight's beam. Someone or something was standing on the edge of the yard, just beyond the trees. My pulse quickened. My instincts screamed that I needed to do something. I moved to the door and locked it again, double-checking to make sure it was secure. My mind spun with thoughts of what could be happening. Maybe it was just someone passing through, someone else who had gotten lost in the woods. But the footsteps were deliberate, not random. Whoever or whatever it was, they were walking with purpose. I felt stupid, standing there frozen, not knowing what to do. My phone was charging in the other room, and I realized I could call the police, but then I hesitated. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps in the woods? It felt ridiculous, but at the same time, everything about the situation felt wrong. I finally grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking. The operator answered almost immediately, but as I started explaining the situation, I was interrupted by a loud bang at the door. My heart skipped a beat. The sound wasn't just a knock. It was more like someone slamming their fist against the wood. I jumped back, the phone still pressed to my ear, but I couldn't form words. The operator was asking something, but I couldn't focus on anything but the sound outside. The bang came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping against the door. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. This wasn't just some random person, it was deliberate, and it was happening right now. The scraping stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I could make a run for it. But I hesitated, wondering if that would be worse. Should I hide? Should I wait it out? My mind was racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Then the door handle rattled, slowly, almost teasingly, the sound of someone trying to open it. I scrambled for a plan. I didn't have a weapon. There were no firearms, nothing that could protect me. I could only rely on what I knew. I had grown up camping, hiking, and surviving in the woods. I knew how to stay quiet, how to stay hidden, how to stay alive. I dropped to the floor, creeping away from the door and toward the small kitchen. My mind raced with possible scenarios, each one worse than the last. But just as I got to the kitchen, the scraping sound came again, followed by a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A soft whisper, like someone was trying to be heard without being noticed. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the tone. It wasn't someone trying to be friendly. I backed away from the door, still listening. The voice came again, this time more forceful. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I didn't know if I should move or stay put. The silence was almost worse than the noise. The hairs on my neck stood up. I stayed crouched down, listening for any sign of movement. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone leaving. The footsteps faded, heading back into the woods, growing fainter and fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed where I was, still crouched, waiting, not daring to make a sound. But nothing came after that. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I finally allowed myself to stand up and breathe. Slowly, I made my way to the door, peeking out through the window again. The yard was empty, no sign of anyone. I didn't know if the danger had passed, or if it was just lying in wait. But I had survived. I was still alive. In the morning, I packed up everything I could carry and left. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I didn't care about the peace and quiet. All I wanted was to get back to safety. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. The woods behind me seemed as quiet as they always had been. But I knew better now. Some things in the woods are better left untouched. It was late October when I found myself driving through the winding roads of the Idaho mountains, heading toward a cabin I'd rented for the weekend. The place was in the middle of nowhere, far from any towns or people. I'd been looking forward to the peace and quiet for weeks, needing a break from the chaos of city life. The cabin, a small wooden structure surrounded by towering pine trees, seemed like the perfect spot to unplug, relax, and clear my mind. I was in my late 20s at the time, and even though I had spent my share of time in remote places, this one felt different. There was an unsettling weight in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the drive that got to me, or the fact that I hadn't seen another car in hours. Maybe it was the overcast sky, the heavy clouds that made it feel like the world was holding its breath. Either way, as I drove further up the mountain toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I eventually arrived at the cabin, parked the car, and grabbed my bag from the trunk. The old wooden structure stood before me, quiet and still, nestled among the evergreens. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the wind and the occasional bird call. I walked up to the door, unlocked it with the key the owner had left for me, and stepped inside. The place was small but cozy. There was a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, a couple of chairs, and a wooden dining table. The smell of old pine and dust filled the air, but it wasn't unpleasant. I set my things down and took a moment to breathe in the silence. It was just the kind of solitude I had been craving. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. The crackling of the flames was the only noise in the cabin, and the warmth from the fire was comforting. But as the night wore on, I started to feel restless. Something about the silence felt oppressive, like the cabin itself was holding secrets, old and forgotten. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but it was hard to shake. At some point, I dozed off on the couch. I woke up a few hours later, the fire nearly out, leaving only the soft glow of embers. The room was dark, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. My heart started to race for no real reason, and I sat up quickly, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. There was no reason to be scared. It was just a cabin in the woods, right? I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the blackness. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with the weight of the night. But then, in the distance, I saw something, a figure moving slowly through the trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the shape was too tall, too human. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat, but the figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I pulled away from the window, my mind racing. I must have imagined it, I thought. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, and I lay awake listening to it, my mind running in circles. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wood, seemed to echo louder than before. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun was out, breaking through the thick clouds that had loomed over the mountains the day before. I went outside to stretch my legs and clear my head, but as I walked around the cabin, something caught my eye. A set of footprints, fresh in the dirt, leading toward the woods. I froze. The tracks were large and they were too recent to be mine. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and I could tell the prints hadn't been there long. My first instinct was to chalk it up to an animal, but there was something about the size and shape of the prints that didn't sit right with me. They were too big, too deliberate. I spent the rest of the morning inside, pacing, trying to calm myself down. I tried to focus on the beauty of the place, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. But the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. That afternoon, I decided to go for a hike. I needed to clear my head, to get away from the cabin for a while. I grabbed my jacket, packed some water, and set off down the trail that wound through the trees. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. I tried to focus on the beauty of the surroundings, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The trail led deeper into the forest, the trees thickening as I moved further from the cabin. I didn't know why, but I had the sense that I shouldn't be this far out. It was the kind of place where it was easy to get lost if you weren't careful. But I kept going, the path narrowing as I moved deeper into the woods. The sounds of the forest, birds, wind, the rustling of leaves, faded away, replaced by an eerie quiet. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, coming from behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My first thought was that it was an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't the wind or a bird. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods behind me. I turned around, but saw nothing. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and shadowed, offering no clear view of what might be lurking just beyond them. My skin prickled, and I hurried to turn back, retracing my steps toward the cabin. But the feeling of being followed lingered, and I quickened my pace. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, fading light through the trees. I locked the door behind me and sat down, my nerves still on edge. The silence in the cabin felt deafening now, and every small noise seemed amplified. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cabin seemed too quiet, too still, the kind of stillness that made your skin crawl. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the words blurred together as I found myself looking up every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the window. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that it was all in my head. But as I sat there, in that dimly lit room, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night, and when morning finally came, I decided that I had enough. I packed my things, left the key on the counter, and drove away without looking back. The sense of relief that washed over me as I left the cabin behind was overwhelming. I never went back, and I never spoke about it to anyone. Sometimes, when I'm alone and the wind howls through the trees, I still feel that same sense of unease, as if something is out there, waiting. It was the winter of 2011 when I decided to take some time off work. I was 32 back then, working long shifts at a machine shop in Des Moines. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and even though I didn't want to admit it at the time, it had really shaken me up. I didn't feel like being around anyone. All I wanted was quiet and space. One of my coworkers had told me about a cabin he and his brother had built a few years back. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a working fireplace, a small generator, and was fully stocked with basics, blankets, canned food, tools, all that. It was out near the edge of a state forest in southern Minnesota, not far from a lake that froze over in the winter. I don't think the place even had a real address. He said they used it mostly for deer hunting in the fall, but otherwise it sat empty. He handed me a key and some rough directions drawn on a napkin and said I could use it for as long as I needed. I didn't ask too many questions. I just packed up my old SUV with warm clothes, some extra food, and a few books. I didn't bring any electronics except my phone, which barely had signal in the city, let alone out in the woods. That was the point, though. I wanted to disconnect from everything. I left early on a Friday morning. The roads were icy, but manageable. As I drove north, the towns got smaller and the snowbanks got higher. By the time I reached the final turnoff, it was just a narrow trail carved through knee-deep snow. I had to switch into four-wheel drive and go slow. Trees hung over the road, heavy with snow. It was quiet, so quiet it felt unnatural, like the whole world had been put on pause. The cabin was tucked at the end of the trail, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine and birch. It was a simple, single-story structure with a pitched roof, a small covered porch, and a narrow chimney puffing thin smoke from the pilot light. The siding was gray wood that had started to warp, and one of the porch steps looked cracked from age and weather. Still, it had a charm to it, quiet and forgotten but solid. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and ash. There were a couple of chairs, a fold-out cot, a wood stove in one corner, a table with mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with dusty canned food. There was also a rusted metal sink that drained into a gray water barrel under the porch. No running water, no real plumbing. A small outhouse sat about 30 yards out behind the trees. I unpacked and got a fire going. There was plenty of split wood stacked along the back wall. It didn't take long to warm the place up, and once I laid out my sleeping bag and took off my boots, I felt like I had stepped into another world. No noise, no stress, just me and the woods. The first couple of days went exactly how I had hoped. I read, I took long walks on the frozen lake, I split wood just to keep busy. I didn't see a single person the entire weekend. There were old animal tracks in the snow. Deer, foxes, maybe even a wolf, but nothing fresh. Every sound was either the wind through the trees or the creaking of old wood. At night, the silence got so deep it almost buzzed in my ears. I'd sit near the fire, stare at the flames, and eventually drift off to sleep without even realizing it. By Monday, I felt like I was starting to settle into the place. I had developed a routine. Wake up, light the stove, eat some oats or canned stew, walk for a few miles, come back, chop more wood, and read until dark. The days were short that time of year, and by 4 in the afternoon, the sky would already start dimming. It was around the middle of that week that I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't anything big at first, just small things. One morning, I found the front door wasn't latched. I was certain I had locked it from the inside the night before. I always did. The wind could have shaken it loose, I thought, but it still bothered me. Then I started noticing marks in the snow around the cabin. Not fresh boot prints, nothing that clear. But some of the snow near the sidewall had been disturbed, like someone had walked through and dragged something. It wasn't deep or obvious, and it could have just been an animal. But I hadn't seen any new tracks on the trail, and the marks didn't look like they came from paws or hooves. It looked more like a line, like something had been dragged through. The next day, I noticed the small storage shed about 20 feet from the cabin had its door open, just hanging there, swaying slightly in the wind. I hadn't gone near that shed yet. I didn't have a key for it, and I figured it was just full of old tools or gear. But I know it had been shut when I got there. I walked over to check it out. The lock was still hanging from the hasp, but it wasn't closed. Inside, there were racks of tools, an old axe, a couple of shovels, a stack of buckets. Nothing weird, just regular stuff. I closed it again, latched the lock, and walked back, trying to shake off the unease in my gut. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. I kept thinking I heard things outside, branches snapping, snow crunching. At one point, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and looked through the window. I couldn't see anything, just the empty woods and the outline of the shed. The cold air seeped through the window frame and made me shiver. I told myself I was just getting too in my own head. That kind of silence plays tricks on you. You start imagining things. The brain wants to fill in gaps. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. The next morning, I woke up and went outside to relieve myself near the edge of the trees. The snow around the cabin was still untouched. No footprints or tracks. I walked a few steps out, and that's when I saw something stuck in the side of the cabin wall. A hunting knife. It was buried in the wood, blade deep. Not just dropped, thrown. Someone had to have been pretty close to lodge it in like that. The handle was black and rubberized. A simple grip. It didn't look old or rusted. It looked like it had been there less than a day. I pulled it out and turned it over in my hands. No markings, nothing unique. Just a basic, sharp knife. My whole body tensed up. My stomach twisted. I knew I was alone out there. No one should have been that close. I didn't even hear anyone. I scanned the woods again, turning slowly in a circle. Nothing moved. I didn't even hear birds anymore. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed one of the chairs under the doorknob. It was a small cabin. There weren't many places to hide, but I checked every inch of it again. Nothing had been moved, and the windows were still locked from the inside. The rest of the day, I stayed close to the fire, the knife on the table next to me. I didn't eat much. I just sat there listening. As night came, I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, staring out the front window. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear quickly and loaded the SUV. But when I tried to start it, nothing happened. The engine cranked once, then went dead. I tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood, checked the battery, it looked fine. All the wires were still in place. I got the voltmeter from the cabin and tested it. It was dead, completely drained. That shouldn't have happened. The battery was new, and I hadn't used the truck for anything except to get there. I checked the gas tank, still 3/4 full. Tires were fine. Nothing was leaking, but the truck wasn't going anywhere. I thought about walking out, but the nearest town was at least 20 miles away, and there was no real road. Just that snow trail, covered again by last night's flurries. The temperature was supposed to drop even lower that night. I didn't have snowshoes or proper winter hiking gear. I could maybe try it, but if I got caught out after dark, I'd be dead before morning. I had no choice but to wait another day, maybe two, until the snow let up and I could make a better plan. That night, things got worse. I woke up around midnight to the sound of wood creaking. Not the usual groaning from the stove or the roof expanding. This was steady, close. I grabbed the flashlight and knife and stood up. I didn't turn on the lamp. I crept toward the window and peeked through a slit in the curtain. There was a figure standing out near the shed. Not moving, just standing there, like a shadow cut out of the snow. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape, tall, thin, wearing something dark. No light, no sound, just standing still in the snow, facing the cabin. I stared at it for what felt like an hour. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to breathe too loud. I don't know how long I watched, but at some point, I blinked, and it was gone. I checked the rest of the night every 10 minutes, waiting for it to come back. It never did. By morning, I was done waiting. I packed what I could carry in a small bag, bundled up with every layer I had, and started walking out. I didn't care about the truck. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that place. The snow was deep and slow going. I stuck to the trail, following my old tire ruts from the week before. My legs burned. My feet went numb. Every sound made me whip around, expecting to see something behind me. After hours of walking, I finally saw the edge of a plowed road in the distance. A red pickup was parked just off the shoulder, and a man in heavy winter gear was clearing snow around a mailbox. I'd never thought much about the whole getting away from it all thing until my friend James suggested it. He'd found a remote cabin nestled in the woods, somewhere near the edge of a national forest up in northern Minnesota, a place where no one could bother us. It seemed perfect, a chance to escape the noise and stress of city life. It was a small, old cabin, one that looked like it had been around since the 1950s, but that added to its charm. There was something about being in the wilderness, far from the nearest neighbor, that was appealing to me. The plan was simple: drive up, stay for the weekend, enjoy the quiet, and head back home. A small group, me, James, and a couple of his friends, would meet up and spend a few days in solitude. I liked the idea of just hanging out in nature for a while. James was a bit of a wild one, always looking for the next adventure, and he'd been to this cabin a few times before. He swore it was a great place, though he'd always spoken of it with a certain hesitation. He'd never gone into much detail, just said it was the perfect spot for getting away from it all. We arrived around dusk on a Friday evening, and as we pulled up the dirt road leading to the cabin, a strange feeling settled in my chest. I wasn't sure what it was, but it felt wrong. The trees around us grew dense, dark, and quiet, their branches heavy with the weight of age. The air felt cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. I brushed it off as the usual unease you feel when you're in unfamiliar territory. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Small, weathered, and tucked away in a clearing, almost like it was meant to be forgotten. The windows were dusty, and the porch creaked under the weight of years. The setting sun cast long shadows that made the place seem even more isolated, more alone. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was cozy in a way, with a fireplace at the center and a few mismatched pieces of furniture scattered around. There were old photographs on the walls, but the kind that seemed to hold onto secrets, as if they were trying to tell you something, though you couldn't quite figure out what. The rest of the group was already unloading gear, laughing, and settling in. We had food to cook, drinks to share, and games to play. James was as upbeat as ever, excited to be there. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy. It wasn't just the isolation. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something watching. That night, as we sat around the fire, I noticed the noises around us. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the calls of animals in the distance, were there, but there was something else. Something faint, almost imperceptible. Like a low hum. It wasn't constant, but it came and went. I asked James about it, but he just laughed, telling me I was probably hearing the wind. But the more I listened, the more I was sure it wasn't the wind. I woke up in the middle of the night, a strange feeling stirring me from my sleep. The cabin was deathly quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful. It was unsettling. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing, and the creaking of the wooden beams above me seemed unnaturally loud. I lay there, eyes wide open, trying to shake the sense that something was wrong. I could have sworn I heard footsteps outside the cabin, faint at first, like someone was walking just beyond the threshold. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped, but the air felt thick, suffocating, as if it was waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside, watching. The noise came again, this time closer. A steady rhythm that sounded too deliberate to be the wind or a passing animal. I wanted to go to the window to see if someone was out there, but my body wouldn't move. My muscles felt frozen, my breath shallow. I knew I had to look, but fear held me in place. The minutes dragged on. Finally, the sound of footsteps faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I tried to act normal. We spent the day hiking, talking about nothing, just enjoying the time away from our busy lives. The sun was out, the sky clear, and everything seemed fine. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for us. James didn't seem to notice. He was in his element, laughing and joking as we climbed the rocky hills and crossed the streams. But I was increasingly aware of the isolation. The cabin wasn't just isolated geographically. It felt as if it was cut off from the world entirely. There were no other cabins nearby, no sign of civilization for miles. It was a place forgotten by time, untouched by progress. That night, as we sat around the fire again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The trees at the edge of the clearing, just at the point where the forest began, were still unnaturally still. I thought I saw something moving there, but when I looked again, it was gone. My mind raced. Was it a person? Was someone hiding in the woods? Or was it just my imagination? I tried to distract myself by focusing on the conversation, but the unease gnawed at me. I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, something shifting in the shadows. It wasn't just the trees. It was the air itself, thick with a sense of anticipation, like something was waiting for the right moment to make its move. Later that night, I woke up again, but this time, I didn't hear footsteps. The silence was more profound, more suffocating. The temperature had dropped, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I lay there, listening to the deep silence, wondering if I was just losing my mind. Then I heard it. A knock, a soft, deliberate knock on the door. My heart stopped and my stomach dropped. Who would be out there? There was no one else for miles. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, hoping it was just an animal or some trick of the wind. But the knock came again, louder this time, as if someone was pressing their hand against the door. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't speak. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. The knock came a third time, and this time I couldn't hold back. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and rushed to the window. I looked out into the darkness, but there was nothing there, no sign of anyone, just the empty, silent woods. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, watching the trees sway in the wind. I was desperate to see something, anything, that could explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. The forest was silent again, but now the silence felt different. It felt as though something had been there, something that was now waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, I packed my things and left. James didn't understand why I was so eager to leave, but I didn't care. The place had gotten to me. I'd never felt fear like that before, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what else could happen. The cabin, the forest, everything about it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for us to show up. I didn't tell James about the knocks or the footsteps or the feeling of being watched. I didn't have to. The look in his eyes when I said I was leaving said everything. He'd felt it too, but he didn't want to admit it. We left the cabin behind, the woods swallowing it whole as we drove away. As I glanced back through the rearview mirror, I felt a sense of relief, as though I were finally escaping something that had been clinging to me, waiting to drag me back into the darkness. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. The feeling that something was out there, watching us, stayed with me long after we left. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft knock on the door. In October 2014, I decided to take a solo trip into the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. I was 31 back then and had been going through a rough stretch mentally. Burned out from work, stressed from family drama, and honestly just tired of being around people. I figured a week in a remote cabin would help clear my head. I'd done solo trips before, usually to the coast or into the woods with a tent, but this time I wanted something more isolated and quieter, somewhere I could sit by a fire with no phone signal and not see a single person for days. I found this old cabin on a rental site that was way out there. It wasn't some polished Airbnb-style retreat either. It was a rugged, no-frills place at the edge of the Nantahala Forest, right near the Tennessee border. No running water, a wood stove for heat, propane for cooking, no cell signal, no Wi-Fi. They marketed it as perfect for off-grid solitude, which was exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for 8 nights. I packed up my Jeep with enough supplies for 10 days. Dry food, canned stuff, water jugs, sleeping bag, firewood, a small generator, tools, and a solar-powered battery pack. I brought 2 flashlights, a lantern, extra batteries, my old .22 rifle just for safety, and a hunting knife I kept in the glove box. I left early on a Sunday and started the 6-hour drive from my place in Durham. The last hour of the drive was slow and rough. Once I got off the paved roads, I had to follow this winding gravel path through dense forest, up steep hills and through ruts deep enough to swallow my tires. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low and the shadows were long. It sat on a little clearing halfway up a slope, surrounded by trees on all sides, maybe 100 yards off the trail. You couldn't see the road from the cabin, and once I shut the engine off, the silence was complete. No birds, no wind, just still, damp air. The cabin looked like something out of an old hunting magazine. Hand-built from thick logs, moss growing on the roof, a small porch with a bench and a stack of firewood leaning against the wall. The inside was dusty and cold, but solid. 1 room, 1 bed, a tiny table, a wood stove in the corner, and a shelf full of old canned food and faded paperbacks. There was an outhouse about 30 feet away in the trees. The place smelled like mold and old firewood, but it felt safe enough. The first few days went by quietly. I spent the mornings chopping firewood or walking the nearby trail. Afternoons, I sat on the porch reading or just staring at the woods. At night, I lit a fire, made simple meals, and wrote in a notebook by lantern light. It was peaceful. No noise, no emails, no deadlines. Just the sound of fire popping in the stove and the occasional creak of the old logs shifting as the night air cooled. By the 4th night, the weather had changed. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped fast. The air had that dry, sharp smell that always came before snow. I checked the little weather radio I brought and heard reports of an early cold front moving in from the north. Snow wasn't supposed to fall until later in the season, but sometimes up in the mountains things hit early. I wasn't too worried. I still had plenty of food, and the Jeep was parked within walking distance. I figured I'd just hunker down and wait it out. That night, the snow started. At first, it was just light flurries tapping against the cabin roof. But by midnight, it was coming down hard. I stood on the porch watching the forest disappear under a thick white blanket, flakes spinning in the wind like ashes. I remember feeling almost lucky, like I timed it perfectly to see the first snow of the year in total silence. I stayed out there until my hands went numb, then went inside, stoked the fire, and fell asleep with my sleeping bag pulled tight. The next morning, I woke up to a world completely changed. The ground was covered in nearly a foot of snow, and more was still falling. The trail to the road was gone. My Jeep was barely visible under a thick white layer. I didn't panic, just figured I'd wait it out. I had enough supplies for at least 5 more days. I boiled snow for extra water, made a bigger fire, and bundled up in all my layers. But that night, something shifted. It started with a sound. I had just turned off the lantern and crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a crunch. Then another. Heavy footsteps in the snow, slow and steady, coming from the direction of the trail. I froze, listening. It wasn't an animal. I'd grown up hunting and hiking. I knew the difference between the quick, shuffling steps of a deer or the quiet padding of a fox. This was different. These steps were deliberate, human. I waited, not breathing, ears straining. The steps stopped somewhere near the outhouse. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely blinking, listening. I didn't move from the sleeping bag until the faint blue light of morning crept in through the window. When I finally opened the door and stepped outside, the snow had stopped falling. The forest was completely still. No prints anywhere around the cabin. Nothing near the outhouse. Just smooth, untouched snow. I told myself it was a dream. Maybe I dozed off and imagined the whole thing. I had been tired, and the wind had picked up overnight. Maybe it was branches falling, or maybe a bear, even though I knew they'd be bedding down by now. I spent the day on edge, checking the trail, circling the cabin, watching the trees, but nothing seemed out of place. That night I didn't sleep. I kept the fire burning and stayed wrapped in a blanket in the chair by the window, watching the forest. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again. The same slow, heavy footsteps, this time circling the cabin. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The steps were deliberate, slow, one after another in the snow. They made a full loop around the cabin. Then they stopped right at the front door. I grabbed the rifle, but I didn't move toward the door. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, heart pounding, hands clenched on the stock. No knock, no voice, just silence. And then, after maybe 2 minutes, the steps moved away, back toward the trees, fainter and fainter until they disappeared. I didn't sleep again. The first light, I stepped out and looked around. This time, there were prints. Clear human boot prints. Big ones. Maybe size 12 or 13. They came from the woods, not the trail, looped around the cabin, stopped at the door, then disappeared into the forest again. I followed them for about 30 yards before they vanished into the trees. No branches broken, no tracks doubling back. Just gone. I felt sick. I went back inside, bolted the door, and stayed there all day. I kept the fire small so the smoke wouldn't show. I didn't cook. I barely moved. Just sat with the rifle on my lap, listening. That night, no footsteps, just wind. But I still couldn't sleep. The next day, things got worse. I went to check on my Jeep, thinking maybe I'd dig it out and try to leave, even if the road was rough. But the hood was open. I hadn't touched it since arriving. Someone had popped the hood and taken the battery. Not just unplugged, taken it. It was gone. Wires cut, not cleanly, but hacked through. The snow around the front of the Jeep was disturbed, like someone had been crouching there. No prints left, wind had covered them, but the battery was gone. That's when it hit me that someone didn't want me to leave. I ran back to the cabin and stayed locked inside, heart racing. Every sound outside made me flinch. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in total darkness, hoping whoever was out there wouldn't come back. I held the rifle all night, but nothing came, just wind. The next day, I packed everything. Food, water, clothes, rifle, flashlight. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't stay. I knew there was a ranger station about 9 or 10 miles west, maybe more. No signal, no help. But if I followed the trail and cut through the ridge, I might make it before dark. I left most of my gear behind and started walking. The snow was deep, and every step was hard. I moved fast, always looking back. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, branches cracking, but when I stopped, the forest went silent. I kept going. I made it maybe 6 miles before I saw smoke. Not in the sky, just faint, rising through the trees up ahead. I crept forward and saw a small campfire in a clearing. No tent, no gear, just a fire burning low and a single, filthy sleeping bag laid out beside it. And next to it, the battery from my Jeep. I didn't step into the clearing. I backed away slowly, turned, and moved as quietly as I could through the woods, off trail, downhill, fast. I didn't stop until I hit the edge of a fire road and followed it until nightfall. I slept under a fallen log that night with the rifle across my chest. By mid-morning the next day, I reached the ranger station. I told them I'd gotten lost, left out details. I didn't want to deal with the whole story, not then. They helped me get to town, and from there I got a tow truck back up to retrieve my Jeep. The guy said the whole engine had been tampered with, wires cut. Back in late September 2013, I took a maintenance job with a property management company that handled a few rental cabins around the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I was 28 at the time, just out of a rough divorce, and needed something that would let me be alone for a while. The company was small and privately owned by a man named Martin who seemed to like hiring people like me. Quiet types who didn't ask for much and worked hard. The job sounded perfect. Check up on a few cabins after the summer rental season ended. Do minor repairs. Report anything serious. It was off-season, which meant no guests, just me in the woods, fixing up old steps, patching broken windows, and making sure nothing fell apart over winter. The company provided me with tools, a four-wheeler, and access to a cabin I could stay in during the job. The cabin they put me in was higher up the mountain than most of the others, a little more remote. I was told it used to be a ranger's cabin back in the 60s, then remodeled in the late 90s to be part of the rental program. Now, it mostly served as a utility cabin for staff. It was a one-bedroom, single-story structure with a small wood stove, propane-powered lights, and a generator out back that could be used sparingly. I was supposed to stay there for about 3 weeks, until all 5 cabins on that stretch of the ridge were winter-ready. I started moving in the last weekend of September. Leaves were turning, air was getting crisp. The company's main office was about 20 miles away, down in town, and they only expected a weekly check-in unless something major happened. I liked the quiet, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me, the forest, and the job. For the first 5 or 6 days, everything was fine. I'd wake up early, make a fire, have some instant coffee, then head out on the four-wheeler with a backpack full of tools. I'd ride the logging trails out to one of the cabins, inspect everything, replace broken planks, recaulk the windows, clear the gutters, and take photos to document the work. One of the cabins, Cabin 4, had a busted back door that needed replacement, so I ended up going there a couple times. It was down in a small hollow, maybe a mile from mine, surrounded by thick spruce and pine. Quiet place, the kind of quiet that presses in around you. The first time I went there, I noticed a small pile of stones stacked behind the shed. Looked like someone had started to build something and left it unfinished. I didn't think much of it. About a week in, weird little things started happening. The first one was small. I came back from a long day at Cabin 2 and noticed the generator at my cabin was on. I never turned it on unless I needed to use the outlet for charging my drill. It wasn't a flip switch either. You had to go out back, pull a cord, prime it, then hit the start. I didn't remember using it that morning. I figured maybe I'd forgotten, or maybe I'd started it and it failed to shut off. But it bugged me. A couple days later, I was working on Cabin 3, just tightening some stair rails, and I felt like someone was watching me. It wasn't a sound, just this heavy feeling behind my back. I kept glancing toward the tree line. Nothing there. Still, I wrapped up earlier than usual and rode back to my cabin before dark. The sun was dropping faster every day by then, and the trails twisted through long stretches of shadow even in the afternoon. That night, I checked the locks on my cabin door twice before bed. Just felt uneasy. I had a bear spray canister in my backpack and a hammer I kept beside the bed. Not that I expected to use them, but it made me feel a little better. On the 11th day, I found boot prints behind my cabin. They weren't mine. I always wore the same pair of rubber-soled work boots, and these were different, bigger, lug pattern, looked like some kind of hiking boot. The tracks came from the tree line, circled the back of the cabin, past the generator, and then stopped near the woodpile. Just stopped. No return trail. No tracks heading back into the woods. I looked for 10 minutes, thinking maybe I was missing something, but it made no sense. The ground was soft enough from the rain the night before that even my own steps left clear prints. Whoever made those steps walked up to my cabin and didn't leave. I didn't sleep well that night. Kept listening for footsteps, branches, anything. I had the stove going and it creaked every now and then, the metal expanding and contracting, but each time it did, my heart jumped. Next morning, I went to Cabin 5, which was the farthest one out. Deep into the trees. The ride took almost 30 minutes on the four-wheeler. It was in worse shape than the others. Roof shingles curling, the deck soft with rot, one window cracked. I started taking photos, noting the damage, and then saw something that made me freeze. A piece of duct tape stuck to the inside of the cracked window. On it, written in black marker, "Not safe." It didn't look fresh, but it wasn't weathered either. Could have been there for weeks, maybe longer. Maybe it was a joke left by a renter. Maybe it was meant for the company or for the cleaning crew, but it didn't feel like a joke. I took a photo of the tape, documented the rest of the damage, and left faster than usual. On the way back, I kept checking the trail behind me, like I expected someone to be there. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me, not just quietly existing around me. Back at my cabin, I double-checked everything, locked all the windows, barricaded the back door with a piece of scrap wood, slept with the hammer next to me again. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe the tape was old. Maybe the boot prints were mine, just distorted in the wet dirt. I kept trying to come up with explanations, but none of them sat right. That night, I woke up to a sound, something outside, a scraping, not metal on wood, more like wood on wood, like a log being dragged slowly across a porch. I held my breath and sat up in the dark. The stove had gone out and the cabin was cold. I didn't move, just listened. The sound came again, slow, heavy, something shifting weight. Not a raccoon, not a fox. This was bigger. I sat like that for at least an hour, frozen, ears straining. Nothing else happened. No more noise. But I didn't sleep. I watched the windows until the first gray light of morning. Next day, I found scratches on the outside of the cabin wall, near the back window. Not claw marks, these were horizontal, uneven, as if someone had dragged a stick or a metal tool back and forth, slowly, deliberately. There were 5 of them, each about 2 feet long. Under them, the grass was flattened. That was the day I decided to leave early. I packed up most of my gear, radioed the main office from the trailhead, the only spot with weak reception, and told them I was cutting the trip short, said the generator was acting up, said the road might wash out soon. I lied. They didn't care. Martin told me to turn in the keys and toolkit by the end of the week. I left the cabin that afternoon and rode into town. Stayed at a cheap motel. Couldn't sleep much there either, but at least I had walls that didn't creak and a door that locked with a deadbolt. I turned in the keys the next morning, didn't tell them about the boot prints or the scratches or the tape. For a long time, I thought maybe it was just some drifter. Maybe someone lived off the grid out there and didn't like people close by. But the thing that still eats at me is this. A few months later, I checked the company's website out of curiosity. Cabin 4, the one with the stone pile, was no longer listed. Neither was Cabin 5. I never saw anything in the news. No missing persons. No reports. But those cabins disappeared from the rental listings. Quietly, without explanation. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I picture those boot prints behind my cabin. How they came from the woods, circled me, and then vanished. And I still wonder if someone was living out there that whole time. Watching, waiting. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from my regular life. It was the spring of 2017, and I had been working nonstop in a small machine shop in Indiana for the last 9 years. My back ached every morning, and my hands had gone from smooth to calloused and dry. I had saved enough money to take a month off and do something I'd been meaning to try. Complete solitude. I didn't want a beach or a hotel. I wanted to be alone in the woods, with no traffic, no noise, no deadlines, no phones ringing. I had found a place listed on an old travel forum, nothing fancy, not even on Airbnb. A man had posted about a small, isolated cabin in western Montana, miles from any town. It didn't have electricity or running water, but there was a working wood stove, a hand pump for water outside, and it was surrounded by miles of forest and trails. It was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin belonged to some family that no longer used it, and they were renting it out for next to nothing, as long as you didn't expect any comforts or check-ins. They sent me the coordinates and a few printed directions. I packed my truck with gear, sleeping bag, canned food, tools, extra clothes, a lantern, batteries, and everything I thought I'd need to live out there for at least 3 weeks. I left Indianapolis on a Wednesday morning and drove for almost 2 full days, stopping only to sleep in my truck. Once I crossed into Montana, the scenery started changing. Trees got taller, roads got emptier. I passed fewer and fewer cars. The GPS cut out as I expected, and I followed the directions they gave me. The final 10 miles were nothing but a narrow dirt road, winding uphill through forest. No signs, no fences, just trees, rocks, and more trees. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: silence. A thick, clean silence. The cabin sat on a little hill overlooking a narrow stream. It was made of thick, gray logs, probably cut right from the land. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it was simple. Just one big room with a stove in the corner, a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and a bed frame with no mattress. I had brought an inflatable pad and a sleeping bag, so I set up camp. For the first few days, it was everything I hoped for. I woke up to the sound of birds and the breeze moving through the pine trees. I hiked around the area, gathering kindling and exploring the trails nearby. I found old deer tracks, heard coyotes far off at night, and even saw a moose by the stream one morning. I kept a journal and tried to write every day. I barely used my phone, and even if I wanted to, there was no signal. By the end of the first week, I felt lighter. My shoulders didn't feel so tight. My thoughts weren't racing anymore. I spent more time sitting still, just staring at the trees, listening to the wind. I even lost track of what day it was, and that felt good. But sometime near the middle of the second week, I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. I was hiking along a trail that looped behind the cabin, going up toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. It was a path I had taken before, but this time I noticed something I hadn't seen: footprints. At first, I thought they were mine from a few days earlier, but these were deeper, fresher. The ground was soft from a light rain the night before, and the prints had clear edges. They were boot prints about the same size as mine. That wasn't too unusual. I figured maybe someone else was out here, maybe another hunter or hiker. But what stuck with me was the direction of the prints. They weren't going up the trail, they were coming down it, leading straight toward my cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing little sounds: twigs snapping, the breeze brushing the cabin walls. I sat up in my sleeping bag for almost an hour, staring at the door. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. The forest has animals, and animals make sounds. But something about those prints kept tugging at me. I got up early the next morning and checked around the cabin. I looked at the path behind the hill. The prints were still there, clearer in daylight. They stopped just 20 feet from my cabin, then turned back the way they came. That detail stuck in my head like a splinter. Someone came close, but didn't knock, didn't say anything, just came near and turned around. The next few days, I didn't hike as much. I stayed close. I kept checking around the cabin every few hours. I started to notice more little things that felt off. Once, I found the side window cracked open. I was sure I had shut it tight the night before. Another time, I saw a mark on the wood by the front door, like someone had dragged something metal across it. I started keeping my axe by the bed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon had clawed at the door. Maybe the wind had popped the window. I tried to explain it all away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Late one evening, I saw smoke far off through the trees. I stood by the ridge trail and looked toward the north. Just a thin line of it drifting up, too far to smell, but definitely smoke. I thought maybe it was another campsite or someone burning brush, but it was in the middle of the forest, not near any road. I watched it until it faded. That night, I barely slept again. The woods went too quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. It was the kind of silence that felt full, like something was watching me. I kept the lantern on all night and stayed wrapped in my bag, my back to the wall, staring at the door. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed up all my food and gear into the truck. I was ready to leave, but a part of me still felt like I was overreacting. I hadn't actually seen anyone. I hadn't heard voices or anything clearly threatening, just weird feelings and little signs. I decided to stay one more night just to see if anything else happened. If it didn't, I'd calm down and finish my last week. That was a mistake. That evening, I lit a small fire outside. I was trying to feel normal, trying to convince myself there was no real danger. I ate some canned beans and watched the flames flicker. When the sky started going dark, I put the fire out and went inside. I bolted the door and sat by the stove for a while, writing in my notebook. Just before I got into my sleeping bag, I heard something outside. At first it was faint, just crunching, like someone walking slowly over gravel or dry leaves. I froze. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. Then it started again, closer this time. I grabbed the axe and moved to the corner, beside the stove. I turned off the lantern and waited. My heart was pounding in my ears. There were no windows on that side of the cabin, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, moving slow, circling. I waited for what felt like an hour. Then I heard the creak, the front step. Someone was standing right outside the door. I gripped the axe so hard my fingers went numb. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I listened. For minutes, nothing. Then the handle on the door turned. It was slow, careful, almost gentle, but the door didn't open. I had bolted it. After a long second, the handle released, and I heard nothing. I stayed there until the sun came up. When I finally opened the door, there were no footprints. The ground was hard, but I knew what I'd heard. I knew someone had been there. I got in my truck and left that morning without eating, without packing everything. I left behind half my gear. I drove nonstop until I reached the next town, and from there, I checked into a motel and stayed 2 nights just to sleep and shower. I called the family that owned the cabin once I got signal again. I didn't tell them everything. I just said I left early and something didn't feel right. They didn't seem surprised. Just said, "That's okay. Not everyone likes being off the grid." I didn't ask them anything else. For weeks after I got back to Indiana, I kept thinking about it. I thought about who might have been out there. A squatter? A hermit? Some drifter living off the land? Or maybe it was someone who didn't want people near their territory. But what scared me the most wasn't the noise or the prints. It was that they never tried to talk, never made themselves known, just watched, moved quietly, got close. I haven't gone camping since. I won't go out that deep again, not alone. Some places aren't meant for us, not because of ghosts or creatures or legends, but because sometimes other people are the scariest thing you'll find in the woods. It was September 2017 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone in a remote cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was 34 at the time, going through a divorce, and needed a break from everything. My job in Grand Rapids had me glued to a screen most days, and I'd gotten tired of the noise, the traffic, and the same 4 walls of my apartment. I found a listing for a rustic cabin just north of Crystal Falls, nestled in the middle of the Ottawa National Forest. No internet, no cell service, no electricity. Just a wood stove, a pump for water, and 4 walls between me and the wild. That's exactly what I wanted. I left early Friday morning. It was a 6-hour drive through smaller and smaller towns until the pavement gave way to gravel roads. The last half hour was just winding paths through dense trees with barely enough room for my Subaru to pass. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low and the air was already cooling fast. The place was smaller than it looked in the pictures. Just one room with a tiny loft for sleeping, a wood stove, and an old rocking chair beside a dusty window. I unpacked my gear. I'd brought enough food for the weekend, a cooler with ice, and a small propane camp stove to cook on. There was a table made of old pine boards, 2 chairs, and some shelves stocked with lanterns, candles, matches, and a few old books about local wildlife. I didn't plan on doing much. Just reading, hiking, maybe taking some notes in the journal I'd been neglecting. I didn't even bring a gun, just bear spray and a knife. The first night was quiet. I lit a fire in the stove and boiled some water for instant coffee. I sat in the rocker and listened to the wind move through the trees. It felt good to be away from everything. I could hear my own thoughts again. I went to bed early, wrapped in a thick sleeping bag on the narrow mattress in the loft. Saturday morning, I went for a hike. There was a trail that looped around a small lake about 2 miles from the cabin. I saw moose tracks, a beaver dam, and even startled a group of turkeys. I didn't see another soul the entire time. I got back to the cabin around noon, made some lunch, and spent the afternoon sitting on the small porch, staring into the woods. That night, I noticed something strange. Right after I blew out the lantern and climbed into the loft, I heard movement outside. At first, I thought it was wind in the trees, but then it sounded like heavy steps in the leaves. Not constant, but slow, like someone walking and stopping. I lay still for a while, gripping the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. The sound didn't come closer. After maybe 15 minutes, it stopped altogether. Sunday morning, I was tired. I hadn't slept much. I went outside to check around the cabin. I didn't see any tracks. It had rained lightly overnight, so if anything had walked close, there would have been prints in the damp soil. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a moose maybe. I made coffee and tried to enjoy the quiet again. But all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd be sitting at the table or out on the porch, and every now and then I'd get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I told myself I was just jumpy from the noises the night before. Still, I didn't go for another hike. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping some kindling and straightening up. That night, I decided to keep a lantern lit. I set it low and placed it near the window. The wind had picked up, and branches tapped against the roof now and then. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they came closer. I froze. I was lying in the loft, heart pounding, holding my knife again. The steps circled the cabin slowly. A few times they stopped completely, then picked up again. I reached for the bear spray, the only weapon I had. I stayed perfectly still. Then I heard something drag across the porch, like a stick or maybe a foot. Slow, deliberate. My stomach turned. I wanted to look out the window but didn't want to move. After maybe 10 minutes, the sound faded into the woods again. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake until dawn, just lying there, gripping the knife with one hand and the bear spray with the other. When morning came, I climbed down from the loft and checked outside. The ground was muddy near the steps from the rain. I found prints. They weren't from any animal I knew. They looked like boots, large ones. Someone had been out there. My first instinct was to leave right then, but I tried to stay calm. I figured maybe it was just a hunter passing through, someone who got curious seeing smoke or light from the cabin. Still, it felt wrong. The nearest town was miles away. This wasn't a place people just wandered by. I packed up most of my gear and loaded the car. I left a few things inside, just in case I was overreacting. I wanted to stay one more night, partly because I didn't want to feel like I was running away. I spent the day inside, doors locked, knife on me the whole time. Just after sunset, I heard something again. Not steps this time, but metal. A clinking sound. It was faint but steady. I turned off the lantern and went still. Came from the back of the cabin. I crept toward the small window over the sink and looked out. I couldn't see anything in the dark. Then I heard wood crack. Something heavy stepped on a fallen branch or maybe the edge of the porch again. I stayed down, holding my breath. I didn't want to use the lantern, but I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on for just a second, sweeping the beam through the window. Nothing. I decided I wasn't going to wait. I grabbed the keys, my bag, and quietly opened the front door. I stepped out, trying to keep my boots from crunching on the gravel. I unlocked the car and got in, heart racing. The woods felt too quiet. No wind, no bugs, just stillness. When I turned the key, the headlights lit up the trail ahead. Something was there, just at the edge of the light, maybe 20 feet away, standing between two trees. I couldn't make out the face, but it was a man. Tall, wearing a jacket and standing perfectly still. My stomach dropped. I hit the gas and drove. I didn't stop. The gravel kicked up under the tires, and I fishtailed a bit getting back to the main road. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting headlights to appear behind me. But there was nothing. I made it to a gas station 2 hours later, back near Iron River. I parked under the lights and just sat there. I didn't go back for the rest of my stuff. I didn't care. I told the owner of the rental that something felt off and I'd left early. I didn't give details. Since then, I haven't gone back to any cabin alone. I still hike and camp, but never in a place that isolated. I'll never forget the way that man stood there, just watching, not moving. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he'd been out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. The cabin was taken off the rental site a few months later. No explanation, just gone. Maybe someone else had a worse experience than me. Or maybe the owner finally realized it was too far out for comfort. I think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods and the wind gets quiet. I always check behind me now. I always make sure I'm not being followed. And I always trust my gut. That weekend taught me that danger doesn't always come loud or obvious. Sometimes it just waits, watches, and doesn't need to say a word to make you feel it. It was September 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything. I had just turned 34 a few weeks before and was starting to feel worn out in ways I couldn't quite explain. Not just tired from work or from the city or from people, but from noise, from screens, from nonstop motion. My apartment in Columbus was too crowded with everything I hated. Car alarms at 3 in the morning, muffled arguments through paper-thin walls, the glow of streetlights bleeding through blinds that never quite shut properly. I needed to disappear somewhere. I found the cabin through a guy I used to work with. He had bought a piece of land a few years back, deep in the hills outside a town called Sutton Ridge in West Virginia. Said he used to go up there to hunt or drink or just get away from everything. He hadn't used it in a while, but he still had the key and said I could have it for a few weeks if I wanted it. I gave him $100, packed my car with supplies, and drove out of the city before sunrise on a Thursday. The drive took about 6 hours. As I got closer, the roads narrowed, and the hills grew taller. Sutton Ridge was more like a village than a town. A single gas station, a diner, and a handful of houses. The cell signal dropped out about 20 minutes before I got there. I stopped at the gas station to fill up and buy some extra batteries and water. The woman behind the counter didn't even look at me when I paid. That suited me fine. The last stretch of the drive was a dirt road that wound through the trees. The directions were handwritten, and the road signs were missing in some places. It took me 3 tries to find the turnoff that led up into Crow Hollow, the part of the hills where the cabin sat. The road turned steep and rough, and I had to drive slow to keep from bottoming out. After about 10 minutes of climbing, the trees opened slightly, and the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I expected. A one-room structure made of dark, weathered wood with a slanted roof and a rusted metal chimney. The windows were small, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. There was no fence, no driveway, no mailbox. Just the cabin sitting alone in the clearing, surrounded by trees that had grown thick and tall. I parked to the side and sat in the car for a while, engine off, windows down. It was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not silent. There were birds calling in the trees and wind rustling through leaves, but quiet in a way that wrapped around you. I felt it pressing against me, like water against skin. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was basic. A twin mattress on a wooden frame, a table and 2 chairs, a shelf with some canned food and matches. There was a fireplace on one side with a small stack of firewood beside it. No electricity, no plumbing, no Wi-Fi. I didn't care. I hadn't come for comfort. That first day, I unpacked slowly, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, arranged my food on the shelf, and swept the floor with a stiff broom I found behind the door. By sunset, I had a small fire going in the fireplace and was sitting outside with a can of beans in my hand, listening to the crickets. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet tasks. I hiked around the area, chopped some wood, read old paperbacks I'd brought with me, and cooked simple meals over the fire. The weather was good, cool in the mornings, warm in the afternoons. I started waking up early and going to bed not long after dark. I stopped checking my phone. It stayed in the glove box, turned off. By the 4th day, I noticed I hadn't seen a single person. No hikers, no hunters, not even the distant sound of a car on the road below. Just birds, insects, and the occasional distant rustle of something moving through the trees. I liked it that way. It made the place feel untouched, private. But on the 5th night, something changed. It was just after 1 in the morning when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had gone out, and the inside of the cabin was cold. I lay there under the sleeping bag, eyes open, listening. I thought maybe it had been an animal outside, the kind of thing you shrug off and go back to sleep. But then I heard it again, a soft thud, not loud but close. I sat up slowly and looked toward the front window. The glass was dark, and I couldn't see anything. I didn't have a flashlight next to the bed, so I grabbed my phone and flicked it on. The screen lit up my face and nothing else. I stood and walked to the window, shined the phone outside, just trees. Then I heard it again, this time from the side of the cabin. Another thud, a little louder. It wasn't a footstep. It sounded like something hitting wood. I froze, heart starting to speed up. I held the phone like a weapon, like the light could scare something off. After a few minutes of silence, I told myself it was probably a branch falling, or a raccoon, something normal, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves, so footprints were useless. I didn't see anything out of place, but on the far side of the cabin, halfway up the wall, there was a fresh scrape in the wood, long and shallow, a few inches wide, like something heavy had slid down the side. That day, I carried my hatchet with me. I didn't like doing that, but it made me feel a little better. I stayed close to the cabin and kept checking behind me. Every time a bird moved in the trees, I jumped. That night, I bolted the cabin door and kept the hatchet by the bed. Around midnight, I heard the thud again. This time, it came from the roof. It was a dull, sudden sound, like something heavy dropping onto the shingles above. Then silence. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling, listening. A second thud, then a scraping sound, something sliding along the roofline, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. I sat there until dawn, the hatchet in my lap, phone in hand, afraid to move. When the light finally crept through the windows, I went outside. There were fresh marks on the shingles, not deep, but visible. Scratches like claws or boot soles, and a dent near the edge like someone had jumped down. I didn't have cell signal, but I still tried to make a call. No luck. I wanted to leave. I really did. But the idea of driving down that road, with the trees pressing in on both sides, not knowing who or what might be out there, it felt worse than staying. At least in the cabin I had 4 walls and a door, so I stayed one more night. I barricaded the door with the table and nailed the windows shut from the inside. I kept the fire small and stayed in the darkest corner, watching the door. Nothing happened that night, but the next morning, I found something hanging on the porch. It was a rabbit, dead, gutted, and strung up by its back legs with fishing line. The cut had been clean, the body drained of blood. I hadn't seen a single rabbit the entire time I'd been out there. I couldn't figure out how someone had done it without waking me up. The porch was just a few feet from my bed. That was the last straw. I packed my things in 15 minutes, left the firewood, the canned food, everything. I drove fast and didn't stop until I hit the main road. When I got back to Sutton Ridge, I pulled into the gas station and called my friend, told him everything. He didn't say much, just said, asterisk. Yeah, I haven't been up there in a while. Asterisk. I didn't sleep for 2 days after I got home. I still don't know who was up there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some local screwing with me. Maybe a squatter. Maybe someone living in those hills watching for strangers. But they were careful, silent, patient. They could have come inside if they wanted to. They didn't. They just let me know they were there. That's what still gets to me. They didn't try to hurt me. They just wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I've never gone back. Never will. I still have dreams about the sound of someone landing on the roof. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear it again. Just a soft thud, and silence after. It was early autumn when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been living in Indianapolis for the past few years, constantly juggling work and life. A bit of peace was all I craved. So, I rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The place, situated in a small town outside Bloomington, looked perfect for a getaway. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Just what I needed. I rented the cabin for a week. The rental agency assured me that it was an old, but well-maintained place, and the pictures online were inviting. Exposed wooden beams, a cozy fireplace, and an abundance of windows to look out at the trees. It was small enough that I wouldn't feel overwhelmed by isolation, but big enough for me to stretch out and enjoy some peace. I was hoping to catch up on some reading, go hiking, and maybe even do a bit of journaling. I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. When I arrived, the first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. The air felt thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of fragrance you only find deep in the woods. I could hear the rustling of the leaves in the wind, but other than that, there was no sound, no cars, no people, nothing. It felt like I was the last person on Earth. The cabin itself was everything I had hoped for. It sat nestled between two tall pines, with a small porch that looked out over a small creek running through the woods. There was an old-fashioned rocking chair on the porch, and I could already imagine myself spending evenings in it, watching the sun set behind the trees. Inside, it was cozy but simple. There was a wood-burning stove in the living room, a small kitchen off to the side, and a staircase that led to the bedroom. I unpacked my things, settled in, and immediately went to explore. I wanted to get a feel for the land surrounding the cabin, and since there was no immediate rush to do anything, I thought it would be a good idea to stretch my legs and take a walk along the trail the cabin owner had mentioned in the instructions. The trail was marked, winding through the woods, following the path of the creek. I was starting to feel the pull of the wilderness, the calm of nature settling over me as I walked deeper into the forest. The farther I went, the more the sunlight dimmed, as the trees thickened overhead, their leaves rustling like whispers. It was peaceful at first, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't that the woods were unfamiliar or unwelcoming. They were just too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. It was the kind of silence that pressed on you, making you hyper-aware of every footstep, every snap of a twig. I shrugged off the feeling and kept walking. After about a half hour, the trail split into two directions, one leading deeper into the woods and another that seemed to head towards the creek. I chose the latter, figuring it would be nice to sit by the water for a while. The creek wasn't far from the trail, and as I approached, I could hear the gentle rush of the water. There was a large fallen log that stretched across the creek, and I decided to cross it to get a better view. The log was slippery. The moss clinging to it made every step a little more treacherous, but I made it across without issue. On the other side, the ground was soft, and I sat down, taking in the view. As I sat there, the sensation of being watched crept back. I couldn't see anyone, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the hairs on my arms prickled. It was a strange feeling, something I couldn't explain. I stood up quickly, almost knocking into the trees in my haste to get back to the cabin. I didn't like the way the woods felt anymore. They had gone from being peaceful and serene to something else. The quiet now felt oppressive. I made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, hoping that once I was inside, I would feel better. The hike hadn't been strenuous, but the feeling of being followed, or maybe just the tension, had left me rattled. When I finally got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and took a deep breath. I told myself that I was overreacting, that I had just been spooked by the silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I cooked myself a simple dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, and settled in front of the fireplace with a book. The warmth from the fire slowly calmed me, and by the time I finished eating, I was feeling more at ease. I decided to turn in early. The bed was soft, and the covers were thick. I had no trouble falling asleep, but that's when it started. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise that had disturbed me. It was just an awareness, a nagging feeling. Something was off. I lay there in the darkness, listening, but I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary. The wind had picked up outside, rustling the trees again, but it was no different than earlier in the day. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sensation of being watched returned. I pulled the covers up tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing unease. And then I heard it, a sound soft but distinct, a rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush just outside the cabin. The sound was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening harder. Came again, closer this time. I knew then that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call someone? No, there was no phone signal out here. Should I look outside? I didn't want to. My mind raced through the possibilities. Someone lost in the woods, an animal, a hiker who had gotten off the trail. But nothing seemed to make sense. I was in the middle of nowhere, far from any roads, and no one was supposed to be out here. My heart raced as I lay there, staring into the darkness, straining to hear anything more. The rustling stopped, but I didn't feel any safer. I stayed still, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. The wind had died down, and it was eerily silent again. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind spinning, unable to let go of the fear. Finally, I must have drifted off to sleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I spent the day trying to push the events of the night before out of my mind. I went on another hike, taking a different trail, trying to remind myself that I was just overthinking everything. I stayed close to the creek, where I felt safer, and tried to clear my head. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was exhausted. I made dinner, ate, and went to bed early again. I hoped that I could sleep soundly this time, but the anxiety from the previous night lingered. The next night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The rustling. It was closer this time. My heart jumped into my throat, and I couldn't move. I just lay there, frozen in the dark, hoping it was nothing, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Someone or something was outside, moving around the cabin. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there waiting. I got out of bed quietly and moved to the window, peering through the blinds. The moonlight was dim, but I could make out the shadows of the trees, the dark shapes of the pines against the night sky. There was no one there, no figure moving around, just shadows. But the feeling of being watched was still there, heavy and suffocating. I stayed by the window for what seemed like an eternity, watching, listening. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a flash of movement, quick and subtle. My heart raced as I turned to look fully, but whatever it was, it had already disappeared. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, wallet, keys, anything I thought I might need, and bolted out of the cabin. I didn't care where I went, just that I needed to leave. The woods were no longer a peaceful retreat. They had become a prison. I ran through the trees, my legs burning from the effort, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't stop until I found a road. I wasn't sure how far I had run, but it didn't matter. I kept walking until I flagged down a passing car. I don't even remember how long I stood there, waiting, but when the car finally stopped, I climbed into the back seat without a word. The driver didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I just needed to get as far from that cabin as possible. It was early November of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 32 back then, living in a small rented apartment in Louisville, Kentucky. I worked at a logistics company, and the stress had been slowly eating at me for the past year. Nothing major happened, just the usual stuff. Tight deadlines, rude clients, long commutes, and no real time for myself. I needed a break before I completely burned out. A friend of mine, who I hadn't talked to in a while, had mentioned an old cabin his uncle used to own out near Harlan County. The place had been empty for years, and he said it was now mostly used by family during hunting season. He gave me the rough directions and told me I could stay for as long as I wanted. It was deep in the woods, maybe 2 hours from any decent-sized town. That sounded perfect. I packed light, just a duffel bag with clothes, some canned food, water, and a few supplies like a flashlight, a utility knife, and my old hiking boots. I also brought a couple books and a notebook. I left my phone on but planned to keep it off most of the time. I wanted real peace and quiet. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads twisted more the deeper I went into the woods, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. The place looked rougher than I imagined. It was a single-story log cabin, sitting on a gentle slope with tall trees crowding the edges. The front porch sagged a little and the windows were dusty, but it looked solid. It didn't have electricity, and the only water came from a well out back. I unlocked the door with the key my friend had mailed me and stepped inside. It smelled like dust, old wood, and faint traces of smoke. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed in the corner. A few old blankets were folded on the mattress, and everything had a thick layer of dust. I opened the windows to let in some air and started cleaning a bit before setting my stuff down. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. I didn't realize how used to background noise I'd gotten living in the city. Out here, there were no cars, no sirens, no neighbors talking through thin walls. Just wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of something moving in the woods. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me and watched the stars. They were sharper and clearer than I remembered. The next few days passed slowly, and I settled into a simple routine. I woke up early, chopped wood, made a fire, boiled water from the well, and spent time reading or walking nearby trails. I didn't see anyone. I wasn't expecting to. It was hunting season, but I hadn't heard any gunshots, and the nearest property was miles away. By the 4th day, I noticed little things that didn't sit right. First, I found boot prints near the back of the cabin. They were fresh, maybe a day old, and not mine. I hadn't gone around the back at all. I told myself it could have been someone passing through. A hunter, maybe, but the print wasn't made by a hunting boot. It was wider and flatter, like a work boot. Later that night, I swore I heard something outside. Not an animal. Something walking. 2 legs. I turned out the lantern and waited in the dark, listening. The sound stopped, and I sat there for over an hour before finally forcing myself to go to bed. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. More prints, a few leading toward the woods, and one set that stopped at the window near the bed. I hadn't heard anyone knock. Nothing was taken or moved, but someone had definitely been out there. I started locking the door at night, even though it probably wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted in. I also started keeping my utility knife close, just in case. I thought about leaving, but something in me didn't want to give up. I had come here to disconnect, to clear my head, and I wasn't going to run because someone might be wandering around. On the 6th night, I was woken up by a noise. It was a slow, creaking sound, like a floorboard under pressure, but it came from outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. A few seconds later, there was a soft thump on the porch. Not loud, not fast, just one. Then another. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. I moved slowly toward the front window, staying low. When I looked out, I didn't see anything at first. Just trees, moonlight, and the outline of the empty chair I had left out. But then I saw a shadow move. Someone was standing just beyond the porch, partly hidden by the edge of the cabin. They weren't moving, just standing there. I couldn't make out a face or even a shape clearly, but I knew someone was there. I didn't move. I waited. Eventually, they stepped back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up my stuff. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care if I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I just knew I didn't feel safe anymore. But when I went to start my truck, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but it was dead. The battery was fine when I got there, and I hadn't left any lights on. I opened the hood and checked, but I'm no mechanic. Nothing looked obviously wrong. Then I noticed the gas cap was off. Not missing, just unscrewed and hanging. I hadn't left it like that. Someone had. I didn't know if they'd siphoned the gas or just messed with it to scare me. Either way, I was stuck. There was no cell signal, and the nearest road was over 10 miles away. I grabbed my pack, loaded it with water and food, and started walking. I followed the dirt road that led out from the cabin, hoping it would eventually connect to a bigger road. After maybe 3 or 4 miles, I heard a vehicle behind me. I stepped off the road and crouched in the brush. A dark green pickup came rolling down the path, slow, like they were looking for something, or someone. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see who was inside. But as it passed, I saw the front plate was gone, and the rear plate was covered with mud. On purpose, I stayed hidden until the truck disappeared around the bend. Then I took a different path through the woods, cutting across and trying to avoid the main road. I moved fast, but I was tired, and the forest wasn't easy to navigate. I slipped once, scraping my hand and banging my knee. I kept moving. It took me most of the day, but I finally reached a gravel road. I followed it until I reached a gas station just outside of a small town called Wallens Creek. I must have looked like hell, because the clerk gave me a weird look and asked if I was okay. I said I had car trouble. He let me use the landline. I called my brother, who lived 3 hours away. He drove out and picked me up that evening. I didn't tell him everything, just that the cabin felt wrong and my truck broke down. He didn't ask for more. I never went back. I didn't even tell my friend what happened. I just mailed him the key with no note. A few weeks later, I sold most of my stuff, quit my job, and moved west. Started over. Sometimes I still think about those prints, the shadow in the trees, and the truck with the hidden plates. I think someone knew that cabin was empty most of the time. I think they were used to people coming alone, especially during hunting season. I think they were watching me from the start, but I left before they could do whatever they were planning. That's all that matters. I was 34 years old the year I decided to spend a week alone at a remote cabin in northern Vermont. It was 2019, and I had just gone through a rough divorce after nearly 10 years of marriage. I needed space, peace, and a change of scenery. I was tired of seeing the same walls, the same streets, and the same routines that reminded me of what I had lost. A friend of a friend mentioned a cabin his uncle rarely used, buried deep in the woods, and said I could use it for free if I didn't mind a bit of isolation. I jumped at the chance. I drove up from Massachusetts in early October. The trees were changing color, the air smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke, and it was the kind of cold that stayed on your skin. The last stretch of the drive was a dirt road full of bumps and sharp turns, and my old Subaru hated every minute of it. The road ended near a clearing with an old A-frame cabin sitting just beyond a line of trees. It looked like something out of a brochure. There was a small deck in the front, firewood stacked on one side, and a shed a few yards away. It was completely silent except for the wind and the creaking of the trees. Inside, the cabin was plain and dusty but cozy enough. One main room with a couch, a fireplace, a kitchenette, and a ladder that led to a sleeping loft with a twin bed and a small window. There was no plumbing, no electricity, and the only light came from a couple of old oil lamps. The toilet was an outhouse about 50 feet into the woods. I had packed enough food to last a week and brought plenty of water, a propane stove, a battery-powered lantern, and a solar charger for my phone, even though I had no signal. The first 2 days were quiet and peaceful. I spent the mornings chopping firewood and walking through the woods. The afternoons I read, wrote in a notebook, and napped. I cooked simple meals, listened to the wind, and watched the trees sway. At night, I sat on the deck with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the stars come out one by one. It was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no expectations, no reminders of anything except the sound of my own breath. On the third night, something changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound. Not a loud one, but clear enough to cut through the quiet. It was a soft thud, like something falling or being dropped on the ground outside. I stayed still and listened. After about 10 seconds, I heard it again. Same sound, a soft, dull thump. It wasn't close to the cabin, but not far either. I got up and looked out the loft window. Nothing but darkness and trees. I told myself it was probably a branch falling, maybe an animal. I had seen a deer the day before. I climbed back into bed and pulled the blankets tight, waiting for the next sound. It didn't come. In the morning, I walked the area behind the cabin, looking for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of place. The leaves were thick on the ground, and the only tracks I saw were mine from the day before. I shook it off. That afternoon, I hiked a couple miles down a logging road I had found the day before. It wound down through a thick patch of pine trees and ended near a rocky slope. I didn't see a single person or animal the whole way. Coming back, I noticed something that made me stop. Near the edge of the road, just past a cluster of fallen logs, there were 3 stones stacked on top of each other. Flat rocks, about the size of my hand, balanced carefully. It didn't look like an accident. Someone had stacked them that way. It wasn't creepy exactly, but it felt out of place. I didn't touch them. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I left the lantern on and sat up reading until almost midnight. When I finally climbed into bed, I left the window shade open. It was hard to sleep. I kept thinking about those stacked rocks and that thud I had heard. I must have drifted off because I jolted awake again a few hours later. This time it was footsteps. They were faint but steady, crunching on the leaves outside. They were coming from the left side of the cabin, near the outhouse. I froze. My heart was pounding. I didn't have a weapon except a small hatchet I used for splitting wood. I slid down the ladder as quietly as I could, grabbed the hatchet, and crouched near the door. The steps moved slowly around the side, paused near the front, then faded. I stayed like that for maybe half an hour, barely breathing. I didn't hear anything else. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out and checked around the cabin. No footprints, just wind-blown leaves. I walked out to the outhouse and the shed. Still nothing. I didn't feel safe anymore. I considered leaving that morning, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I imagined it. I tried to believe that. I spent the day closer to the cabin. I didn't hike or explore. I kept the fire going and checked my phone for a signal every half hour. Nothing. Late in the afternoon, I heard a noise from the shed. It was just a tap, like something hitting the metal wall. I walked over slowly. The door was open a few inches. I hadn't left it like that. I stood there for a while before pulling it open. It was empty except for some rusted tools and a stack of kindling. I closed it and dragged a heavy rock in front of the door. That night was worse. I didn't sleep at all. I kept hearing faint noises, but they were never close enough to be clear. A rustle, a crack, a scrape. At one point, I thought I saw movement near the trees, but it was too dark to be sure. I sat up with the hatchet in my lap until morning. On the 5th day, I made up my mind to leave. I packed my gear fast and loaded everything into the car. I did one last sweep of the cabin, made sure the fire was out, and locked the door. I started down the dirt road with my heart still pounding. About 10 minutes down, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. Right in the middle of the road, there was a freshly stacked pile of rocks, just like the one I had seen near the logging trail. 3 flat stones, perfectly balanced. I didn't move for a long time. My hands were gripping the wheel. I looked around and didn't see anyone. I got out, kicked the rocks over, and kept driving. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about an hour away. I parked in a gas station lot and sat there with the engine running. My phone still had no signal. I went inside, bought coffee, and waited until the signal came back. When I finally reached a friend back home, I told him I had cut the trip short. I didn't tell him why. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy, but I knew what I had felt. I knew I had been watched, followed maybe. Someone or something had been near that cabin. A few weeks later, I looked up the area where the cabin was. I didn't find anything strange. No missing people, no crimes, no history of anything unusual. Just forest and hills and an old cabin that probably hadn't been used much in years. I never went back. Now, every time I hear a branch fall or the sound of footsteps in dry leaves, I think about that week. I think about how peaceful it started and how quickly that feeling turned into something else. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I still like the quiet, but only if I know someone else is nearby. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed the full week, or if I had hiked farther down that logging road. But I don't want to know. Whatever was out there wasn't a ghost or some made-up monster. It was something real, person maybe, or people. And that, to me, is a lot scarier. The cabin is still out there, empty, silent, waiting for the next person to show up looking for peace and quiet. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a break from my job in Kansas City. I had been working as a delivery driver for a few years, long hours, no real vacations. I was 34 back then, single and just plain tired. I didn't want to deal with airports or crowded tourist places. I just wanted peace and quiet. So I rented a cabin in northern Arkansas, about 4 hours south. It was listed as a remote hunting cabin near a place called Bear Ridge. The photos showed an old wooden cabin, nothing fancy, but it had what I needed. A bed, a small kitchen, and no cell service. That last part was what really sold me on it. The drive out there took most of a day. I took my time, stopped for gas and food, didn't rush it. The last hour was rough, though. The paved road turned into gravel, then dirt. I had to slow way down because the road twisted through thick woods. I saw almost no signs of other people. No mailboxes, no cars. Just trees, ditches, and the occasional deer running off the side. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was relieved. It looked just like the photos, old wood siding, one story, a small porch with 2 chairs. The forest wrapped around it tight like it had grown around the cabin instead of the other way around. There was no driveway, just a small clearing with enough room to park my truck. The air was heavy and still. No wind, no birds, just quiet. I unloaded my things. I had packed enough food for a week, canned soup, pasta, trail mix, stuff like that. I brought some books, a flashlight, and a few tools just in case. There was no power, but the cabin had a small gas generator and a propane stove. I didn't plan to use the generator unless I had to. I wanted to get away from all that noise. The first day was easy. I settled in, read for a while, took a nap. I sat on the porch in the evening and watched the trees. It was peaceful and I felt like I had made the right choice. I slept pretty well that first night. On the second day, I went for a walk. There was no real trail, just deer paths and breaks in the brush. I wandered around for a couple hours, keeping track of where I came from by noting trees and rocks. The woods were thick. I didn't hear much besides the occasional crack of branches. It was a little strange how quiet it was. No squirrels, no birds, not even bugs. That night, I heard something outside, just a sound. It was past midnight and I had been asleep. It woke me up. It sounded like something scraping against the porch, like a heavy branch dragging or something. I stayed in bed and waited. It didn't happen again. I figured maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon. I made a mental note to check in the morning. In the daylight, I looked around the porch. There was nothing there. No branch, no tracks, nothing knocked over. Just the same dusty boards and my boot prints from earlier. On the third day, I started to feel a little uneasy. I couldn't explain why. It was just a feeling, like someone watching you when you can't see them. I chalked it up to being alone. I wasn't used to it. Back in the city, there were always people, always noise. Out here, it was just trees and wind. That night, I brought the flashlight to bed. I left the lantern on the table just in case. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every hour, listening. A couple times, I thought I heard something far off in the woods. Not animals, more like footsteps, but not close, just far enough to make me question it. On the fourth day, I decided to do some chores around the cabin. The rain from the night before had brought down some branches. I spent a few hours dragging them off. I checked the back of the cabin and found some old boards pulling loose. I didn't have nails or anything, so I pushed them back the best I could. I felt like I had to keep moving. Sitting still made me too aware of how quiet everything was. That evening, I heard the scraping sound again. I was on the porch eating a cold can of beans. Came from behind the cabin. A slow, dragging sound. I stood up and listened. It stopped. I waited a few minutes, then walked around the back with the flashlight. Again, nothing. No animal, no marks. Just trees and dirt. That night was the worst. I kept hearing things. Not loud, not close. Just enough to keep me awake. Crunching in the woods. A faint metallic sound, like metal clinking. I sat up in bed, sweating, holding the flashlight in one hand. I kept the door locked, even wedged a chair under the knob. In the morning, I told myself I was being stupid, probably deer or wind moving old junk. Still, I walked around the cabin with the flashlight even though it was full daylight. I checked the woods in every direction. I found nothing unusual. On the fifth night, it changed. I had dozed off with the lantern still burning low. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a thud. Not a normal thud. This was solid, sharp, like someone dropping a heavy stone onto the porch. I sat up, heart pounding. I didn't move at first. Then I heard it again. Another thud, then scraping. Slow, deliberate. I waited, then stood and tiptoed to the window. I didn't open the curtain, just moved it aside slightly. I couldn't see anything. Just the porch, half lit by the lantern glow coming from inside. Nothing moved, but I could still hear it. The scrape, the pause, another scrape, then silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand. I didn't hear anything else. The next morning, I saw something new. On the edge of the porch, near the top step, was a small pile of rocks. 3 of them, smooth, flat, stacked neatly. I hadn't put them there. I was sure of that. I looked around again. Nothing, just those rocks. That was the turning point. I didn't feel like I was imagining things anymore. Something or someone was out there. I didn't know if it was a prank or someone living in the woods or what, but I didn't feel safe. I packed up most of my stuff that day. I kept the essentials handy in case I had to leave in a hurry. My truck was still parked in the clearing, and I made sure it started and had enough gas. That evening, I stayed inside. I didn't sit on the porch. I didn't turn on the lantern. I sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it was closer. Crunching steps on the gravel near my truck. Then nothing, just silence. At first light, I grabbed everything, threw it into the truck, and got out of there. I didn't look back. I just followed that dirt road until I reached pavement. I didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station near the highway. When I got back home, I didn't tell anyone much, just that the cabin wasn't for me. I didn't want to explain the feeling I had, that quiet dread, that creeping sense that I was being watched. Maybe it was just someone playing games. Maybe it was a squatter or someone who didn't want people out there. I never found out. I didn't contact the owner again. I didn't leave a review. I just let it go. But I never forgot that week. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. Now, over 10 years later, I still think about it sometimes. When I hear a branch scrape a window or something thud on my porch, it takes me right back. I haven't gone on a solo trip since then. I still like the woods, but only in places with people nearby. That sense of being alone, truly alone, out there where help can't reach you. It changes you. There was nothing supernatural about it. Just fear. Raw, real fear. And that was enough. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 33 years old, working in downtown Cincinnati as a warehouse manager. The job paid well, but it wore me out. Long days, little sleep, always noise. I'd recently gone through a breakup too. 6 years with someone I thought I'd marry, and it just fell apart in a matter of weeks. I felt drained. I needed to breathe again. No phones, no people, no obligations. Just quiet. I found this cabin listing online. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. Just a small post on a local message board. Some guy named Terry was renting out his late uncle's hunting cabin deep in the woods near a place called Two Harbors in northern Minnesota. It looked perfect. There were a few photos, an old wooden cabin, a small dock over a lake, and nothing else. No neighbors, no roads in sight. I emailed the guy, wired the rental money, and by the next week I was on the road in my old pickup. Took 2 days to drive up there. The cabin was about 40 minutes from the nearest gas station. The last 7 miles were on a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick pine forest. No cell signal, just the sound of gravel under my tires and trees pressing in close. It was late afternoon when I pulled up to the place. The photos hadn't lied. The cabin sat maybe 50 yards from the water, a narrow, tree-lined lake that barely rippled in the breeze. The dock looked a little crooked, and the wood siding on the cabin had gone gray from weather, but it felt solid. There was a fire ring out front and a stack of wood under a lean-to. It was exactly what I needed. The cabin was basic. A single room with a bed, a wood stove, a table and 2 chairs, and some cabinets with old pots and pans. No electricity, no running water, just a big jug of drinking water left by Terry and a hand pump outside for washing. There was a compost toilet about 20 yards from the cabin, hidden in the trees. Everything smelled like old pine and ash. I unpacked, made a simple dinner with a can of chili and some bread, and went to bed before the sun even set. I slept hard that night. No traffic sounds, no buzz from electronics. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional splash from the lake. I spent the first few days settling into a routine. I'd wake up early, boil water on the propane burner Terry had left, make instant coffee, and then take a walk through the woods. There was a faint trail that led partway around the lake, but mostly I just wandered. I brought a book with me sometimes, or just sat on the dock with my feet in the water. It felt like I was finally pulling all the stress out of my chest. I could feel the tension leaving my shoulders, my jaw. I started sleeping longer, eating better, breathing easier. On the 5th day, I decided to explore farther back from the cabin. There was a second trail I hadn't tried yet. It was narrower, barely more than a deer path, but I followed it anyway. I took a backpack with snacks, water, and a flashlight just in case. The path wound deeper into the forest. The trees got denser, the air cooler. After about 2 miles, I came across a clearing with an old hunting blind up in a tree. It looked abandoned, gray and sagging with time. I climbed up out of curiosity. Inside, it smelled like dry leaves and mouse droppings. Nothing special, just old camo fabric and a broken folding chair. But something about that place felt off. Not scary, just still, like the air didn't move right. No birdsong, no buzzing insects, just silence. I stayed up there for a few minutes, looking out over the woods. Then I climbed down and headed back. The feeling faded the closer I got to the cabin. I shook it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks after days of isolation. That night, I was sitting out by the fire after dinner, just watching the flames. The sun had set and the sky was going dark fast. I started to hear something across the lake. A splash, then another. Not big, just like something stepping in shallow water. I figured it was a deer or maybe a beaver, but the sound kept going. Splash, pause, splash, like footsteps in water. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it across the lake, but the beam only reached halfway. I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped. Everything went quiet. I sat there, waiting, staring into the dark trees. After a few minutes, I went inside and locked the door, even though I knew nothing was out there. Still, it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some wood, fixed one of the chairs that had a wobbly leg, and fished a bit off the dock. But I kept looking across the lake. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything either. Just my nerves, probably. Being alone that long messes with your sense of reality. That night, I heard the splash again. Only this time, it wasn't across the lake. It was closer, down by the shore in front of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and listened. I could hear water moving, something wading through the shallows. I crept to the window and peeked out, but I couldn't see anything. I didn't want to turn on the flashlight and give away my position. The sound lasted a few more minutes, then faded. No footsteps, no voices, no rustling, just the water. I barely slept. I kept imagining someone watching me from the trees. I started to question whether I was really alone out there. Maybe a poacher or a drifter had found their way near the cabin. I decided the next day I'd do a full sweep of the area. If someone was out there, I needed to know. After breakfast, I packed my bag again, added a knife just in case, and walked a wide loop around the cabin. I checked the trail again, climbed back up into the hunting blind, and waited. An hour passed. Nothing. Just wind and distant birds. I hiked further east, where the land dipped into a small ravine. That's when I found something strange. It was a campsite, old and overgrown but not ancient. A fire ring with some half-burned wood. A broken cooler tipped on its side. Torn fabric that might have been part of a tent. Everything was dirty and rotting, but it couldn't have been there more than a few years. I looked around for anything useful, maybe a name tag, a wallet, anything. but I didn't find anything. The weird part was that it felt like someone had left in a hurry. Like they didn't pack up, they just ran. Clothes still hung on a low branch. A rusted knife lay on the ground near the fire ring. The cooler still had old cans inside. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I had no signal. Something about the sight didn't sit right with me. I got back to the cabin around late afternoon. I built up the fire early and kept it going strong. I didn't want to sit in the dark that night. Around 10, I went inside and bolted the door. I kept my knife by the bed and left the flashlight on the table. I barely moved all night, just stared at the ceiling and listened. Nothing happened. The next morning, I was exhausted. I told myself maybe it was time to leave early. I still had 3 days left on the rental, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I started packing things up. Around noon, I heard something out in the trees. Not near the lake this time, behind the cabin. I stepped outside and stood still, listening. Branches snapping, footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, steady, coming closer. I shouted out, but no one answered. I walked to the edge of the clearing, knife in hand, and scanned the woods. No movement. I waited for 10 minutes, heart pounding. Nothing. Eventually, I went back inside and decided I was done. I tossed the rest of my food in a bag, packed the truck, and locked the cabin up tight. I didn't even leave the key where I was supposed to. I just left. I didn't calm down until I was 2 hours south, back in range of cell towers and gas stations. I called Terry and told him I had to leave early for work. He didn't ask questions, just said thanks and hung up. A few weeks later, I saw a news article online. A hunter had gone missing in that same forest, not far from where I stayed. The article mentioned that it wasn't the first time someone had vanished out there. In fact, over the past 10 years, at least 6 people had been reported missing within 10 miles of the lake. Most were hikers or campers. None had been found. I thought about the old campsite I found, about the footsteps in the water, the silence in the hunting blind. I didn't report anything. I figured I'd just sound crazy, but I deleted the pictures. I didn't want a reminder. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone, anyway, and never without cell service. The woods don't scare me, not exactly, but I know now that quiet doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means something else is listening, something real. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided I needed a serious break from the usual stress of my daily routine. I was 34 back then, divorced for about 2 years, and living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a suburb outside of Madison, Wisconsin. Work was draining me, and my social life had fizzled out. I wasn't looking for anything or anyone. I just wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind you can't get in town. I had a friend who told me about an old hunting cabin he used to rent out with his brothers up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about 6 miles outside a tiny place called New Bern. It was rustic and isolated, no plumbing, no internet, no cell service. Just a hand pump for water, a wood stove, and a propane fridge. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I took a week off work, packed up my little Subaru Forester with enough food, warm clothes, firewood, and a few books, and made the 5-hour drive up. It was already chilly that time of year. Leaves had turned and were starting to fall, and it rained a lot that week. The clouds never really cleared for long. The road to the cabin was barely a road, just a winding dirt trail that veered off from a gravel county road, and it stretched about a mile into dense woods. I nearly missed the turn the first time. The place was marked only by a cracked wooden post with a number carved into it, 1702. The cabin looked old but sturdy. It sat on a slight rise, surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. It was about the size of a 2-car garage, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. The front had a small covered porch with a rickety rocking chair. The windows were old, single pane, with green shutters that hung crooked. There was a metal chimney sticking out the side. That stove inside turned out to be my best friend for that week. I unpacked, started a fire, and settled in that first night with a can of chili and a book. The wind outside was constant, brushing the trees like a distant tide. The place creaked a bit, but not in a way that felt alarming. It just felt old. I slept hard that first night. No lights, no noise, just the fire crackling down and the wind. I woke up once around 3 a.m. needing to pee and had to go outside to use the outhouse, which was about 30 feet into the woods behind the cabin. It was pitch black, and I had to use my flashlight. That was when I first noticed how quiet the woods could be. Not just quiet, dead silent. No birds, no bugs, no nothing. It made my skin prickle a bit, but I shook it off as nerves. I was used to city noise. The next morning, I made coffee on the propane burner and took a short hike around the cabin, just to get my bearings. There wasn't much. The trees were thick, and the ground was wet with fallen leaves and mud. About 100 yards to the east, there was a narrow creek. I followed it for a while, but turned back when the brush got too thick. I wasn't there to explore. I just wanted to read, write in a notebook, and maybe think a little. By the third day, I started to notice something odd. Nothing big, just little things. The rocking chair on the porch had shifted slightly overnight, even though the wind wasn't strong. I figured maybe I just hadn't remembered where it was. Then, one morning, I found the pump handle standing straight up. I always left it down after drawing water. Again, I brushed it off. My memory wasn't perfect. One evening, I was chopping some kindling out back when I noticed a tree with several deep grooves cut into the bark about shoulder height. 5 vertical gouges, like claw marks but cleaner and more deliberate. I looked around and saw 2 other trees with similar markings, spaced maybe 20 feet apart. I figured it was a hunter marking his trail. Maybe someone used the area before. That night, I heard footsteps. Not loud, not hurried. Just slow, steady crunching in the leaves, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. I froze, fire poker in hand, listening from inside. It stopped after a few minutes. I stayed awake a while longer, but nothing else happened. I didn't sleep well. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, maybe a quarter mile in every direction. I didn't find anything unusual. No fresh tracks, no signs of other people. I thought maybe it was a deer or a black bear. I carried a hatchet with me after that, just in case. On the 5th day, I hiked back to the creek again and followed it a bit farther. About a half-mile downstream, I came across something strange. There was a pile of rocks, stacked deliberately like a cairn about 3 feet tall. Sitting on top was an old tin can with rust holes. Inside the can was a bird skull, not crushed, just sitting there, clean and white. I didn't touch it. I backed away slowly and returned to the cabin. Something about it felt wrong. It didn't scare me exactly, but it made me feel like I had crossed into someone else's space. I started keeping the door latched even during the day. That night, I was woken by a noise that sounded like tapping. Not on the cabin, but nearby. I sat up and held my breath. Came again, tap, tap, tap. Then a long pause. Then again. It wasn't rhythmic like an animal or a branch. It sounded like something knocking on wood. Not hard, but deliberate. I stayed still for almost an hour, just listening. It eventually stopped. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, I found small, shallow prints in the mud near the outhouse. They weren't boots or shoes. They looked like bare feet but small. Maybe a child's, but narrow and long. The stride was strange, too. Shorter than a normal step. I packed my things that day. I had 2 nights left on my reservation, but I didn't want to be there anymore. I cleaned the cabin, shut the propane tank off, and left a note for my friend saying thank you. Then I drove out. I never looked back. About halfway home, I stopped at a diner just outside of Wausau and took out my notebook to try and write about it. But I couldn't explain what happened. There was no ghost, no monster. Nothing touched me or attacked me, but it didn't feel right out there. It felt like I was being watched, like I had stumbled into something I shouldn't have. I never went back. I never asked my friend about it either. I figured if he knew, he'd already made his peace with it. But me, I'm done with cabins in the woods. Give me traffic and sirens. At least I know what I'm hearing at night. Even now, when I see woods on TV or drive past tree lines on back roads, I think about that place. I think about the stacked rocks and the tapping and those tiny, bare footprints. And I wonder who, or what, was out there watching me while I thought I was alone. Maybe it was just a local kid playing tricks. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I imagined some of it, but I trust my gut more than anything, and my gut told me to leave. I'm glad I did. It was October of 2017 when I took a week off from work and rented a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 32 then, living alone in a small apartment in Albany, New York. I worked in insurance, spent most days staring at spreadsheets and answering emails. Nothing exciting, nothing stressful, but after years of the same routine, I needed a break. I didn't want to go far or spend much. I just wanted silence. I wanted trees, the sound of wind, a cold creek maybe, something that would remind me I was still a real person. I found the cabin on a rental site. It was small, basic, and pretty cheap for a whole week. It was located near the town of Barton, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. The photos showed an old, A-frame style place, with dark wood paneling and a small front porch. There was a stone fire pit outside, a narrow gravel driveway, and thick forest on all sides. The listing said there was no cell service and only a weak satellite Wi-Fi signal, mostly good for emails. That was fine with me. I wanted to unplug anyway. I left on a Monday morning. It was cloudy when I pulled out of the city, but by the time I crossed into Vermont, the sky had opened up into one of those clear blue autumn days that makes the air feel cleaner. The leaves were in full change, and the roads were nearly empty. I rolled down the windows and let the cold wind in. The directions were straightforward until I turned off the main road and onto a dirt one. It twisted sharply uphill through trees, narrowing with every turn. I kept checking the directions, even though there weren't many options to go wrong. After about 3 miles, the road ended in a small clearing, just enough room to turn my car around. The cabin sat at the far end of it, tilted slightly like it had settled crooked over the years. I parked and stepped out. It was colder up there than I expected. The wind didn't reach through the trees much, so the air was still, but it had that bite that said winter was coming early. The cabin looked just like the photos. Dark wood, single front window, steep roof covered in damp leaves. There was a stack of firewood under the awning and a key box on the door. I punched in the code I'd been emailed and let myself in. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and old pine cleaner. The main room was just a combined living and dining area. A couch, an old armchair, and a small wood stove sat in the middle. The kitchen was just a counter with a sink, a mini fridge, and a microwave. There was a coffee pot, 2 mugs, and a half-used container of sugar. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed and a dresser. The bathroom was tiny, but clean. Everything worked. It was cold inside, so I started a fire in the stove right away and unpacked what I'd brought. Mostly food, some books, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. That first night was peaceful. I didn't hear anything but the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I slept early and woke with the sun coming in through the trees. I made coffee and sat out on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching mist rise from the woods. I spent most of Tuesday walking the trails around the property. There weren't official paths, just old logging roads and game trails. I followed one that led downhill toward a stream and stayed there a while, skipping rocks and watching the current. I didn't see anyone all day, and I liked that. But that night, something felt off. Not wrong exactly, just off. It started when I was getting ready for bed. I had just brushed my teeth and was turning off lights when I heard something outside. It was a short, scraping sound, like wood dragging over stone. I froze. Came again, softer this time. I stood still, listening, heart picking up a little. Then nothing. Total silence. I waited a minute, then stepped over to the front window and looked out. Nothing. The clearing was empty. Trees swayed a little in the dark, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or a squirrel running across the roof. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep right away. I kept listening. A few times I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves, but every time I sat up, it stopped. I woke late Wednesday. It had rained overnight and everything was damp. I spent most of the morning inside, reading, watching the fire, and just zoning out. Around noon, I decided to walk again, this time uphill past the cabin, where a narrow trail led toward a rocky ridge. That's when I found the first thing that didn't make sense. About a quarter mile into the woods, I saw an old cooler. It was one of those heavy plastic ones, white with a blue lid. It was sitting just off the trail, half sunk in the dirt and covered in pine needles. I walked over to it and flipped the lid. Inside were 2 empty cans of beans, a melted plastic fork, and a wet, rolled-up t-shirt. It looked like it had been there a while. I didn't think too much of it. Probably just some hunter or hiker left it behind. Still, it felt weird being that far out and seeing someone's old stuff just sitting there. That night, I heard the dragging sound again. It was after midnight. I had just dozed off when it woke me. Slow, steady scraping. I sat up in the dark. The fire had died to glowing coals. I stayed still, holding my breath. It went on for about 30 seconds, then stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. Thursday morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual, no footprints, no scratch marks on the porch, just wet leaves and fallen branches. I tried to shake it off, but it stuck with me. I felt like someone had been out there. I walked again that afternoon, but didn't go far. I kept looking over my shoulder. The trees felt tighter somehow, like they were closer together. The wind didn't move through them like before. When I got back, I sat on the porch until it got too cold. I kept watching the tree line. I thought maybe I'd see a deer or a fox or something, but nothing moved. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud thud on the side of the cabin. It sounded like someone had thrown a rock. I sat up, heart pounding. I waited. Then came another sound, dry leaves crunching, slow and heavy. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. I went to the window but didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to give away my position. I scanned the clearing. The beam of the flashlight shook a little in my hand. I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a long time. The sounds stopped. Eventually, I crawled back into bed and laid there with the light on. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the cabin, near the back corner, were 2 deep scrapes in the wood. They were long, vertical, and looked like they'd been made with a blade. They hadn't been there before. I knew I needed to leave. I packed my stuff fast. I was supposed to stay until Sunday, but I wasn't going to wait around to see what would happen next. I loaded my car, locked up, and started down the gravel road. The trees seemed darker on the way out, even though it was morning. About halfway down the road, I saw something ahead of me. I slowed the car. It was a pile of sticks, right in the middle of the road. Not random, neatly stacked, like a little cone. I had to stop to move them. I got out quickly, looking around as I kicked the pile apart. My hands were shaking. The woods were completely still. No wind, no birds, just silence. I got back in the car and drove the rest of the way without stopping. Once I hit pavement, I didn't look back. I didn't report it. I didn't tell the rental company. I just went home. I didn't sleep much for the next few nights. I kept thinking about those sounds, the marks on the wall, the pile in the road. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and they wanted me to know it. Even now, years later, I haven't gone back to the woods. Not alone. Not that deep. I still think about how quiet it was that last morning. How empty. How planned it all felt. I think whoever was out there had done it before, and I think they were hoping I'd stay one more night. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to rent a remote cabin in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania. I had just turned 37, and life had been running me down lately. I was working too many hours, barely sleeping, and my nerves were shot. My therapist suggested I take a break, get out into nature, unplug from everything, let my brain settle down. I didn't have much family to worry about, and my job allowed remote work, so I thought, why not? I found a listing online for a cabin about 2 hours away from any major town, tucked between state game lands and long stretches of forest. It was small and simple, with no Wi-Fi, no neighbors nearby, and only one dirt road leading in and out. That was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived in the late afternoon, with enough sunlight left to get a good look around. The cabin was rough-looking but sturdy. It had 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with well water and an old shower, and a main room with a wood stove, a table, and a dusty couch that smelled like mothballs. The kitchen was barely more than a counter, a small gas stove, and a fridge running off a propane tank out back. It was colder than I expected inside, and I had to gather some firewood from the small pile out back to get the stove going. The first night, I slept surprisingly well. The silence out there was different than what I was used to. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the woods absorbed sound. No traffic, no sirens, just the occasional rustle from wind or a distant animal call. By the third day, I'd fallen into a routine. I'd wake up early, make instant coffee, and sit on the front steps watching the woods light up in orange and gold. The mornings were chilly, but the sun cut through it by noon. I'd take long hikes on the nearby trails, sometimes walking for miles without seeing another soul. In the afternoons, I'd read or write a little on my laptop, then make a simple dinner and sit outside with a blanket as the temperature dropped again. It was exactly what I thought I needed. The quiet was finally helping my thoughts settle down. My mind wasn't racing like it had been for months, but then things started to feel off. It was small at first. I come back from a hike and notice my backpack wasn't where I left it. I told myself maybe I was just forgetting things. Another time, I found a scratch along the side of my rental car that hadn't been there before. I figured it was from a branch on the narrow road. The wind made weird noises through the trees at night, which is normal, I guess, but sometimes it sounded like breathing or voices far away. I started locking the cabin door religiously, even in the daytime. I kept my flashlight on me always, even when walking to the outhouse out back. About a week in, I was hiking a trail I hadn't tried yet. It followed an old creek with steep ridges on either side. I remember how quiet it was that day. Even the birds seemed to stay away from that stretch. I hiked for maybe 2 hours, not seeing any other trails or clearings, just endless trees and the stream. When I turned around to head back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On a tree, maybe 10 feet off the trail, was a bright orange plastic ribbon tied around the trunk. I hadn't seen it before on the way in. It looked fresh. It had letters written on it in black marker. I stepped closer to read it. It said, "Not safe. Turn back." I stood there staring at it for a long time. I looked around, listening, but the woods stayed silent. I don't know why I didn't turn around right away. Maybe I was frozen, or maybe I didn't want to admit that something was wrong. I ended up walking back to the cabin fast, never really running, but keeping a strong pace and glancing over my shoulder a lot. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the old wood sounded louder. I kept the fire going all night and sat up listening. The next morning, I decided to call it in early and leave. I packed up my things and loaded up the car. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. Dead. The battery was completely drained. I opened the hood, checked the cables, even tried jumping it with the emergency starter I brought. Nothing worked. There was no cell service out here, and I hadn't seen another person in over a week. The dirt road back to town was nearly 12 miles. I told myself I'd walk it the next morning when the sun was out and just hunker down for one more night. I still had food and water, and the weather was dry. That night was worse than the others. Around midnight, I heard something moving around outside. Slow footsteps, crunching leaves. Not an animal. Too heavy. It circled the cabin once. Then again. I stayed still on the couch with the fire dimmed low. My flashlight was in my hand. I didn't look out the windows. I didn't want to see. The sound stopped eventually. I must have dozed off for an hour or so, because when I woke up, the sun was just starting to come up. I opened the door slowly and looked around. Nothing was there, but in the dirt just outside the porch were boot prints. Big ones. Not mine. Not fresh either, but not more than a day old. My hands were shaking while I locked the door again. I packed everything I could carry into my hiking pack, grabbed the rest of the bottled water, and set out on the road by 7 a.m. I didn't stop walking for hours. Every now and then I'd hear something in the woods, and I'd tense up, but nothing came out. Around 3 p.m., a park service truck came rolling up the road. I nearly cried when I saw it. The guy driving looked surprised to see me. He said they don't check that road often anymore since the area wasn't officially maintained. I didn't tell him everything, just that my car died and I needed a lift back to town. He didn't ask many questions. Back home, I had the rental company tow the car. Turns out the battery wasn't dead. It was missing, like gone. Someone had physically removed it. Cleanly. No damage. No tools left behind. Nothing. I never went back to that cabin. I canceled the rest of the stay and told the owner there were maintenance issues. They didn't seem surprised. Just refunded part of my money and never followed up. I tried to research the area a little more, but didn't find much. Just old mentions of hunting accidents and missing hikers. Nothing specific. To this day, I still don't know what really happened. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but someone had been out there, watching, close enough to move my things, to touch my car, to leave those prints, and they wanted me to know they were there. Since then, I haven't been able to enjoy the woods like I used to. I still hike sometimes, but I stick to well-traveled trails, and I never stay overnight. That feeling that someone is watching from behind the trees has never fully gone away. I guess I learned that even the quietest places can hold dangers you don't expect. Not monsters, not ghosts, just people. People who know those woods better than you ever will. It was October of 2019 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 34 at the time, single, and working a remote job as a freelance designer. I'd been burned out from work and sick of city noise in Duluth. All I wanted was peace and quiet. No emails, no calls, no one knocking at my door. A friend of mine had a cousin who owned a small, off-grid cabin by Loon Lake, a place surrounded by forest with barely any cell reception and no internet. It sounded perfect. I packed everything I thought I'd need: food, bottled water, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a knife, sleeping bag, some winter gear, and a few books. I also brought along my fishing rod and a cooler just in case I caught anything worth keeping. The cabin had a small wood stove, a single bed, a table with a chair, and a small counter with a propane burner. No plumbing, but there was an old outhouse about 30 feet out back. Water had to be boiled from the lake or brought in jugs. No one else was supposed to be anywhere nearby. It was late in the season and most of the lake cabins were already boarded up for winter. The first day there was everything I hoped for. The air was clean and cool with that sharp edge fall brings in the north. Leaves were turning, the lake was calm, and there wasn't a single sound except for birds and the occasional splash from a fish. I read half a book on the porch and made a small fire when the sun dropped. That night I slept like a rock. On the second day, I hiked the trail that circled the lake. It was about 7 miles round trip. I took my time, snapping pictures and stopping now and then to sit and just listen. Around the 4-mile mark, I passed an old, broken-down cabin that looked abandoned. The windows were busted and the roof was sagging on one side. A pile of rotted wood leaned against the door. It gave off a weird vibe, but I figured it was just some hunter's cabin from decades ago. I didn't think much of it. That night, I noticed something odd. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up needing to use the outhouse. I stepped outside and everything was still and dark, except I could swear I heard leaves crunching out near the treeline. I held still and listened for a while, but it stopped. I figured maybe it was a deer or a raccoon and went back inside. The next couple of days were calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every morning, small things seemed to be moved. The fishing rod I left on the porch was on the ground. My boots had been shifted a few feet. The firewood pile looked a little different. Nothing serious, just little things that didn't feel right. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. On the 5th night, it rained. Not heavy, but enough to soak the ground. I stayed inside and read until late. When I turned off the lamp and laid down, I again heard something outside. This time it was slower, a careful, steady crunch of wet leaves. I held my breath and just listened. It stopped for a few minutes, then started again, closer. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight, and pointed it out the front window. I didn't see anything. After about 10 minutes, it was quiet again. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. There were faint marks in the wet dirt, like someone had been standing near the porch. Not boot prints, more like deep impressions from someone standing still. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I left them myself earlier without realizing. But I knew I hadn't been out there since before the rain started. That day, I packed up most of my things and put them in the car just in case I decided to leave early. I still had 2 nights left, but the unease was building. I took a short walk but avoided the far trail. I stayed close and kept the fire going longer that night. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a branch snapping behind the cabin. I didn't check. I just stayed still inside, flashlight in hand, waiting for morning. On the last full day, I finally went back to that old abandoned cabin. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find something that would explain what I was feeling. The door was still blocked by the rotted wood, but I cleared it away and pushed it open. Inside was empty for the most part, just broken furniture and a pile of old cans and bottles in the corner. But then I saw something strange. On the far wall, someone had scratched into the wood, "Go home." It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. The scratches still looked sharp, like they'd been made recently. I left right away. The air felt heavier as I walked back. I didn't stop or take photos. I just wanted to get to my car. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the flashlight on and my knife nearby. I sat up in the bed fully dressed. Around 3 a.m., I heard slow, dragging footsteps on the porch. They didn't stop at the door. They circled the cabin once, then faded into the woods. At first light, I grabbed the rest of my gear, threw it into the car, and left. The drive back to Duluth felt long and tense. I kept checking the mirror like I expected to see someone following me, but no one did. I never went back to that lake, and I never asked my friend about the cousin's cabin. Maybe someone was squatting in that abandoned place. Maybe I wasn't alone out there and just didn't realize it soon enough. I don't really know, but I learned something important from that week. When your gut tells you something's wrong, don't wait around trying to explain it. Just leave. I kept those photos I took from the first few days, but I've never looked at them again. I don't even fish anymore, and if I ever go back into the woods, I won't be going alone. It was early November of 2017 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 34 at the time, living alone in a small apartment just outside of Columbus, Ohio. My job in IT had me staring at screens most of the day, dealing with long hours, endless client calls, and last-minute emergencies that never really were emergencies. I'd been burned out for months, sleeping badly, barely eating right, snapping at people over nothing. I needed space. I needed somewhere quiet, off-grid, where I could just shut off for a while. So I booked a week-long stay in a small rental cabin in southern Kentucky. The listing said it was about 15 minutes from the nearest town and had no Wi-Fi, no cable, and barely any cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. The place was near the Daniel Boone National Forest. Not right in it, but on the edge. It was an older, single-story log cabin tucked deep into some wooded hills, with a gravel driveway that twisted downhill for about a quarter mile before it reached the front porch. The owner lived out of state and had a local friend managing the rentals, but they both seemed easygoing when I dealt with them by email. I didn't tell anyone I was going except my older sister. I just packed up my SUV with a week's worth of groceries, a couple of old paperbacks, a cooler with drinks, and my favorite sweatshirt. The drive down took about 5 hours. Once I passed through the last town, the road narrowed, then turned into winding blacktop lined with rusting mailboxes and faded signs nailed to trees. It was late afternoon when I pulled up to the cabin. The air was cool and still. Dry leaves blanketed the ground, and everything had that muted golden brown color that happens just after fall starts to die. The cabin looked smaller than I expected, but in a cozy way. There was a little porch swing, a stack of firewood, and a metal chimney poking up through the roof. No other houses were visible in any direction. No sounds except wind and birds. Inside, it smelled like old wood and ash. The living room had a small couch, a couple of chairs, and a wood-burning stove. There was a little kitchen with basic appliances and a tiny dining nook with windows that looked out into the woods. The bedroom had a queen bed, clean sheets, and a dresser that had clearly seen some years. The bathroom was functional with good water pressure. I unpacked quickly, put my perishables in the fridge, and then took a walk around the property. It was about 2 acres, mostly sloped, with a small trail that led off into the trees but seemed to loop back around. I didn't go too far. The light was fading, and I hadn't brought a flashlight. The first night was quiet. I made a sandwich, read for a bit, then went to bed early. There were some sounds outside. Twigs snapping, owls calling, but nothing unusual for a place that rural. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I brewed coffee and sat out on the porch. The stillness was almost overwhelming at first, like the silence had weight to it. I liked it. I spent most of that day just walking, reading, sitting. I didn't check my phone once. Around late afternoon, I took the trail behind the cabin a bit further. It dipped downhill and crossed a small stream. Beyond that, the trees got denser. I remember seeing an old, rusted metal drum half buried in the ground off the path. Probably junk left by hunters or campers. Still, I felt a weird unease just looking at it. I didn't go past it. The second night was colder. I lit the wood stove using the firewood on the porch, and it warmed the cabin nicely. I drank 2 beers and stayed up later, flipping through one of the books I brought. At some point, I noticed a sound from outside. Not an animal, but something softer, like footsteps through dry leaves. I paused and waited. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but I locked the door before going to bed. The next day, I woke up early. I had that feeling like I'd had a strange dream but couldn't remember it. My head felt heavy. I figured it was just the beer and shook it off. That day, I went into town, about a 15-minute drive like the listing said. It was tiny, just a gas station, a diner, and a couple of storefronts. I filled up the tank, grabbed a few snacks, and picked up a small flashlight since I realized I hadn't packed mine. When I got back, I noticed something small. The stack of firewood I'd used the night before looked different, like someone had res-tacked it slightly. It wasn't a big thing, maybe a few pieces moved, but enough for me to notice. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. Then I told myself maybe it had shifted in the wind, or maybe I hadn't paid that close attention the first time. Still, I brought a few logs inside and locked the door behind me again. That night, I cooked a proper dinner and sat by the fire with the flashlight nearby. Around 11, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, this time slower. They stopped and started, like someone walking in a circle. I turned off the stove light and stood by the window. It was too dark to see anything. I couldn't even make out the trees. I waited for a while. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. I thought I heard creaks on the porch, like someone stepping gently. But when I looked, there was nothing. Still, I left the flashlight next to me. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing was missing, but I noticed something else. 2 muddy footprints on the porch, just faint outlines. Could have been mine from earlier, but I'd worn dry boots and hadn't walked through any mud. I stared at them a while, then grabbed a stick and brushed them off. That afternoon, I walked the trail again, further this time. I passed the metal drum and kept going. The forest got quiet, like unnaturally quiet. I stopped when I saw what looked like an old shack in the woods, maybe 50 yards off the trail. It was mostly collapsed, just some rotting wood and a rusted-out frame. I didn't go near it. I turned around and walked back quicker than I had planned. The 5th night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was heavier, closer. I grabbed the flashlight and looked out through the slit in the curtain. Just trees. But then I heard a tap. Not a knock, just a soft tap. On the back door. My heart was pounding. I stayed still. Then another tap. I backed away and stood in the hallway until the sound stopped. It didn't come back. The next morning, I decided to cut the trip short. I packed everything up and loaded the SUV. But when I tried to start it, nothing happened. Not even a click. Battery wasn't dead. I had power, lights, radio, but the engine wouldn't turn. I popped the hood and checked what I could, but I'm not a mechanic. Everything looked fine, still wouldn't start. I walked up the gravel driveway to where I could finally get 1 bar of service and called a tow company from town. They said they'd send someone out within a couple hours. I waited. Then I walked back to the cabin because the wind was picking up and it was starting to drizzle. When I got inside, I noticed something chilling. The front door was unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked it before I left. I always did. I froze in the doorway, just listening. The cabin was quiet. I moved slowly, checking each room. Nothing was missing, but in the bedroom, the flashlight I kept on the nightstand was gone. I backed out and stood on the porch. I didn't know what to do. The truck wasn't coming for a while. I didn't want to wait inside, but it had started to rain harder. So I stood under the porch roof with the SUV in sight and just waited. Eventually, the tow guy came. I explained the problem quickly and didn't mention the other stuff. He got it started in 10 minutes. Faulty starter, he said. I didn't care. I thanked him, drove back to town, and booked a cheap motel for the night. I didn't go back to the cabin. After I got home, I told my sister about it. She said maybe it was a squatter or just a local messing with me. I called the property manager and told him what happened. He seemed surprised but said he'd look into it. I never heard anything back. A couple weeks later, I saw an online listing for the same cabin, but this time the description mentioned a new security system and updated locks. It made me wonder. Someone had definitely been watching me there, maybe living nearby, maybe just passing through. I'll never know. I still take trips sometimes, but never that isolated. I want peace and quiet, but not like that. I still think about those footsteps, that soft tap on the door, the footprints, the flashlight. I think about what could have happened if I'd stayed another night, but I didn't, and I never went back.